Contrary to what many people thought at the beginning of the pandemic, this virus was not a great equalizer. Many women were left behind.
In the last 2 years, women's participation in the United States labor force has decreased to levels we haven't seen since the early 1990s. We have lost more than 2 decades of progress.
For women of color, the economic toll of the pandemic has been especially profound. It has exacerbated existing disparities in ways that are frankly startling.
We tell young women that they can have a career and a family and achieve some level of work-life balance. But are we really telling them the truth? The pandemic showed us that for a lot of women, it's an empty promise. We need to change that.
As the pandemic continues, you start to wonder, is this what life is going to be like? Are we going to have to juggle our mommy life, our personal life, and our business life? Is this what the future holds? I think with childcare, it disproportionately impacts women when it's not accessible, and it causes women to leave the workforce or to work less than they want to. I'm looking for that human understanding, that empathetic core that understands we're all people and we all have lives. I want to know, how do you value me as a human, not just as an employee?
The goal of the summit is to bring together thought leaders, policymakers, and practitioners to share knowledge on the topic of the economic future of women in the United States and around the globe. Spelman College and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College are dream partners when it comes to covering all perspectives and aspects of the issues related to women's equality.
I hope that this summit inspires people who are in a position to make change and make a difference to do so from wherever they sit. You know, I know that some young women look to the future right now and really wonder what it's going to be like. I hope that as a result of efforts like this, today's young women can actually experience a future of spiritual and material prosperity, a future of well-being, comfort, ease, and the realization of their dreams. That's really what I hope we achieve.
Welcome to the Economy She Deserves, a special 2-day summit looking at how women are doing in this recovery from one of the worst economic crises many people have ever experienced. I am Heather Long, and I work at the Washington Post and am a proud Wellesley College alum. This summit for the next 2 days is being put on jointly by Wellesley College, Spelman College, and the Global Institute for Women at King's College London. It truly is a global effort to dive in and explore these critical issues. Our first panel today is really a rock star panel that looks at how did we get into this she-cession, how unusual is it, and how are women doing now in this recovery 2 years on. I'm thrilled to be joined by 2 top economists today. The first is Betsy Stevenson, a University of Michigan economics and public policy professor. She was an economic advisor to President Obama, a former chief economist to the Labor Department. She's written one of the great textbooks for introductory micro and macroeconomics, and she is also a proud Wellesley College alumna. We are also joined today by Nella Richardson, the chief economist at payroll processor ADP. Nella co-leads their research institute at ADP, which analyzes millions of records on jobs, gains and losses, and wages and pay disparities. She is a former chief economist at Redfin, the real estate company, and a senior economist at Bloomberg. We are thrilled to have her. She was just on CNBC just before she came on, analyzing the March jobs report, which just came out this morning. So welcome, Betsy and Nella, to this great discussion. So let's dive right in. Betsy, can you give us just a really brief overview? How did we end up in this she-cession back 2 years ago? And how unusual is it to see so many job losses for women during a recession?
Heather, thank you for that introduction. It's great to be part of this panel today. And, you really started at, I think, the right starting point, because it is very unusual for women to lose jobs in a recession. In fact, women typically don't lose jobs very much in a recession. And the primary reason for that is the industries that women tend to work in. 1 in 4 women work in private sector education and healthcare jobs. And in every previous recession, that's been an industry you might consider recession-proof. It's continued to grow during recessions. And so women didn't lose a lot of jobs. But that's an industry that contracted during the pandemic. And you might think that's a little unusual. Why did we lose our education and healthcare jobs? But a lot of jobs that weren't affiliated with just treating the pandemic, people got sent home. Dental hygienists got sent home. All sorts of other people who work in education and healthcare. And in fact, most of these caregiving jobs are where we're still missing jobs today. So if we take a look at things like nursing care facilities, childcare jobs, we're still missing a ton of workers in that space. And that reverberates through the economy and impacts what other women and men can do when we don't have those caregiving workers coming back. And of course, everyone thinks of leisure and hospitality, another big service sector job that doesn't get hit as hard as it did here. And we lost nearly half the jobs in leisure and hospitality. And again, that's an industry that hits women harder. So the bottom line was that this hit the places where women work. It put them in a difficult position of either working in a way where they were exposed to significant health problems and abuse on the job, or stepping home and coming, not being able to work. And so we saw women, particularly lower wage women, lost most of the jobs in this pandemic, and they're the ones that have struggled the most to come back.
Nella, give us a sense of where we are. We're 2 years into this recovery. You and I and Betsy, we were just looking at this latest jobs report. It shows us that 93% of jobs lost in the pandemic are now back. That's an astonishingly fast recovery overall for jobs. But obviously, where are women? Are women catching up now? Can you give us a sense of where we are now?
Well, yes, I'll try. Good morning, Heather and Betsy. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with the audience here, and it's great to be part of this really important discussion. Because one thing that the pandemic taught us is that when our social institutions failed because of the pandemic, women had to step up and become those social institutions. They had to become the teacher in the classroom and the elder care worker in the nursing home. That led many women to leave the jobs market, both involuntarily because of job loss, but also voluntarily because of the needs of the family and the home. And I think also what it suggests is that the social infrastructure that is needed for women to not only be participatory in the labor market, but to thrive. And I think that's where we should start. Providing an overview of where the losses came is on wages and pay. because at the end of the day, that's why people work. They work for a paycheck. And going into this pandemic, women were making, according to our data at ADP, and we provide payroll services, so we have a good indication of what people make. We provide those services for about 20% of the U.S. workforce, private sector workforce. What we found is that pay gap was 80% going into the pandemic. It actually narrowed during the pandemic to 82%. Women were making 82% of what men made. But it's a false narrative. The reason why the pay gap narrowed is because so many low-income women lost their jobs. So it was artificial. And so that really speaks to what happened. First of all, we have this wage gap. It's persistent. It hasn't changed despite the amount of progress women have made. But it also shows that women are in vulnerable positions. And it used to be thought of that you couldn't get, as Betsy alluded to, a recession in the service sector. The pandemic has changed all that. But more than that, after the pandemic, you're going to see a change in how businesses operate. Much more digitization, much more automation. And the idea that women may not be brought along to the new economy is something that I worry about, because the skill sets that are needed is changing. So that bridge is going to be important, and closing the gap in wages continues to be one of the key challenges, even as women come back to work.
Well, Betsy, can you give us any encouraging signs? Kind of what does a full recovery for women look like? I think the last time I looked at the data last night, it was, we were still down about 1 million jobs for women. I haven't run the latest numbers this morning, but, are we catching up a little bit at all? Is there any encouraging sign of a full recovery here?
So, well, let's start with the glass half full. We've added 6.5 million jobs over the last 12 months, and 51% of those went to women. Now, women lost more than 51% of the jobs. So, that's the glass half empty part. We still have a gap there. Just this month, women just added 63% of the jobs. So, it goes in fits and starts, but we do see women coming back. But Neela raised some really important points that I want to touch on. So in most recessions, we lose jobs in the goods sector. What happens is those are a lot of men who lose their jobs, and the jobs don't all come back. Some of that is like automation goes in, or just the processes by which businesses decide, this is how we're going to become profitable again. We're going to streamline, and we're not going to bring everybody back. When we went into the pandemic in February of 2020, we still had nearly 1 million fewer jobs in the goods producing sector than we had at the beginning of the 2008 recession. So we hadn't added all those jobs back. Where had the job growth come? It had come in the service sector, where we'd added nearly 15 million jobs. So what that has done is meant that it's been hard to get men back to work historically after recessions. And so the question is the service sector going to experience that right now? Are we going to have a hard time getting women who were in these jobs before back in? And is it, not because the women don't want to come back, but because the jobs have fundamentally changed in a way that has eclipsed jobs, particularly for the most vulnerable women? And I think that is a real concern. And when you ask, will we get back? I think one real question is, what's the right back to, right? Mm-hmm. So is it back to where we were at the start of the pandemic? But at the start of the pandemic, women's labor force participation had been on a 5-year upward trajectory. So should we get back to where that trajectory would have been in 2022 if we hadn't had the pandemic? Would we have continued to grow and deepen women's labor force participation and experience and wage growth or not? And would the service sector, which had been growing at such a rapid clip between 2010 and 2020, continued at that pace? I did an estimate of how many service sector jobs are we missing if we had service sector job growth between 2010 and 2019 continued out to today. And when you do it that way, it's not 1 million jobs we're missing, Heather. It's 5.5 million jobs we're missing in the service sector compared to that trend line. Those jobs were majority female jobs. So, that's where I think the tension is who is the labor market going to recover for? And I think what we know right now is the labor market has recovered very strongly for the highest earning women and the highest earning men, and it hasn't recovered as strongly for more vulnerable workers.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. Neela, you've been stressing this too, that the impacts still lingering, particularly on low-income women. At the Washington Post, we had found that this is the most unequal recession we just lived through. So people earning under $40,000 a year, we had never seen them lose jobs at this pace that we saw, in at least since World War II. You've done a lot of research on low-income women and how things normally work even before the crisis hit. Can you say a little bit about what your research was telling you and the red flags you were seeing even before the pandemic and how that got exacerbated during the pandemic?
I would gladly do so, because in a lot of the discussions about the effects of the last 2 years, people act like it's new, like the gaps we're seeing are new, or the income experiences are new, or the fact that people of color, Black Americans, that the unemployment rate is still double the national unemployment rate, that's new. None of it is new. It's just been exacerbated by the pandemic. And one finding here that I think is really illuminating is during the summer of 2020, the women lost the employment change from January to that summer, according to ADP data, fell by 11%. That's a huge amount of loss. Why? When there were so many gains in employment, more than 4 million gains in a single month in employment over the summer, why did we see this fall off for women? And the reason was the lack of childcare. For low-income women, that was a huge factor over the summer months of 2020, even as the economy was regaining its footing in so many places. And so what was surprising about that, you asked me what happened before the pandemic. This isn't a new pattern. In fact, every summer, women's participation falls from the beginning of the year. And particularly for low-income women, that effect is not present for women making over $50,000 a year, but it is much a part of the labor market experience for people making under $50,000. And so we have the situation where low-income women, are coming in and out of the labor market. And when you do that, it's really important and hard to re-enter, even in a good job, to this experience of the workplace. But we're asking low-income women to basically do this every year because of the vulnerability of their work and how it's not supported socially by childcare. So that's just one of the many findings, and I pointed to the labor gap. I'll just say one quick thing on that. There's this myth out there that the reason why this pay gap exists is that women self-select into low pay jobs and low pay industries. But even if you look at healthcare and education, which is more than 70% women, you still see the gap in pay relative to men. And that gap widens the higher you go up in the career ladder. So even when women dominate in a field, the gap persists. And that points to the institutional nature of that gap. It's not about the people, it's about the work environment in which they're forced to do their careers.
Wow, that's some sobering statistics for sure.
Let's
Betsy,
get back to half full glasses.
I know, we're going to try to find some half full towards the end here. But, Betsy, talk me through some of your big takeaways from what we experienced during this pandemic. I know you have highlighted both the strain that parents, especially moms, went through, but also the strain, that non-parents. There were also a lot of job losses for women who weren't parents. What are your big takeaways specifically for women from the pandemic?
Let me actually start by just following up on something Neela said that I think is really important, which is when people leave the labor force, we don't have a really good pathway for them to come back. So if you step out, whether it's to give birth to a child, because there's no guarantee you can even take a paid single day off to labor, and they don't want you doing that in the workforce. So if you step out, even if it's for a month or 2 months, because you have this new child and you come back, you're stepping way back. You get set back. And so I think that there are two problems with that. One, we force people to step out when we should have a care and paid leave infrastructure that allows people to stay attached. But the second is that it should be okay to step out without losing everything. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why we continue to have this gender division between men and women is because of the fact that we punish people for stepping out just a little bit. And so if you've got, a married couple or unmarried, but a couple where they've got a child, they're going to make a decision for one person to do the stepping in and out and the other person not. And that's where you can end up getting, is that a choice? I don't know. I mean, it's an optimization to optimize household income, but it's not a very good choice. You're dealing with the very real constraint that if you step out of the labor force, you will have very significant setbacks. So you only want one person in the household to ever do that. And then the very real constraint that we do not have adequate childcare. So people are basically on their own in the summer because schools just randomly stop for 3 months. And then you're on your own when it comes to childcare at the very beginning. Now, the thing that makes me optimistic is also something that makes me kind of angry. But what we're really seeing in the data, what we saw in the pandemic, was that fathers really made a lot of sacrifices and fathers were really frustrated by what was going on. So it wasn't just mothers. And that makes me optimistic because I think when men get involved, we'll get change. And that's what makes me angriest too, because it's going to take, men getting involved in saying, hey, we need, year-round childcare to be accessible and affordable and high quality. But I did a survey where I asked parents, what was your experience during the pandemic? Were you able to keep working as usual? And fathers were less likely than mothers to say that they were able to keep working as usual. What we see in the data is that mothers were more likely to leave the labor force, but dads made a ton of sacrifices and moms made a ton of sacrifices beside leaving the labor force. They changed to more flexible work. They turned down promotions. They paused upskilling and training. They cut back their hours. All of those things end up having a negative impact on your career trajectory. To the extent that you want to do it so you can spend more time with your kids, great. But to the extent you're forced to do it because we have an inadequate care infrastructure, that is not good for anybody, not good for the family, not good for the kids, and not good for our economy. And so I think what we learned is we do not have we're not investing in children in our country appropriately. And that spills over to parents because all parents work in many, many, many households, the majority of households. And so as a result, we're failing the kids and we're failing parents and we're failing women.
Yeah. Push that one step further for me. You've been in the White House, you know how hard it is to get policy changed in the United States, but what would your big takeaway message be for policymakers in Washington, D.C.? What do they really need to do if they want to fix this economy to work better for families?
Let me just also say, for anybody out there who's working in state or local politics, we don't have to do this necessarily at the federal level. There's some things I'd really like to see at the federal level, a federal paid leave plan. It's going to be a fairer plan. It's like Social Security, but for when you have children and family needs. And so we need a federal paid leave plan. President Biden's put one out there. There's many bills that have been introduced in Congress. I think the public wants it. It's really time to get that done. But we also have to realize that, childcare and education are two sides of the same coin. We became the wealthiest country in the world by giving K through 12 education to all children in this country. And it's time for us to realize that needs to go all the way to early childhood, 6 months old. We need to start educating kids with appropriate child development. And that also provides care for parents. High quality early childhood education is one side of the coin. The other side is the care that's provided so that parents can work. Those two things are incredibly important, and you can't pay more for childcare than you earn yourself. So we need to make sure all parents can afford it. And we need to do that not on the backs of low-wage workers by saying, well, we just need to drive down wages of childcare workers even further. They're as low as they can go. So we need to be able to pay childcare workers more. And in order to do that, we have to subsidize families that can't afford to pay childcare workers more. But there's just one last, I think the three policies that we need: paid medical and family leave, affordable childcare, and paid sick leave. And we are making no traction at the federal level on paid sick leave, but the pandemic absolutely exposed the need for it. And we're making a lot of headway at the state and local level. And so I'd encourage people to continue to do that, because what we continue to see in the data is people missing work because they're sick. And when you go to work sick, you spread the disease to others, which means more people get sick, and potentially miss work. It's more expensive to not have paid sick leave than to have it.
Yeah, we certainly saw that in January with the Omicron spike. Nela, I want to ask you about the company side of the equation. Your ADP group just did the survey, I believe, of over 30,000 workers. What were some of the key takeaways and findings that workers really want now? And what would your message be to companies? What should they be changing as we come out of this pandemic?
Yeah, well, the number one thing, and this is a global result, you see it in India, you see it in London, you see it in Brazil. All workers have been transformed. And the thing that they are changing is their notion of job security. It's not just a paycheck anymore. In fact, it's the flexibility factor. Workers want flexibility. And most people think of flexibility post-pandemic and they're thinking, oh, people want to work from home. They don't want to go in the office. That's part of it. But it's really flexibility in hours. The reason people want to work from home is so that they can be there for the baseball practice, and they can take the son to the dentist, and they can make sure that, their parent gets their medication on time. That's the flexibility factor. It's not necessarily that everybody wants to work from home in the dirty kitchen with a dog, not speaking from personal experience, but it's about being able to support your life around work. And you're hearing more of that. The good news is companies are listening, and they're listening because companies are motivated by the profit motive, and the profit motive tells them that it is expensive to hire and retain in the labor market that we have. So kind of going back to where we started about this labor market is incredibly tight. There's labor shortages. And the idea that you need to have a talented and skilled workforce has resonated. I don't agree with people who say that workers are in the driver's seat. They are never in the driver's seat, but we have become a noisy backseat driver telling the company where we need to go and where we need to go towards. And that's flexibility. And I think that advantages women, particularly if it's done well. If it's not done well, it can actually hurt women. If there is a two-tiered sense of the workplace where those who take the flexible option, decide to work from home, decide to do the hybrid schedule, are looked at as a different type of worker than the person who goes into the office and has FaceTime, then we're just reinforcing the kind of disincentives and gaps that were present before the pandemic. But if companies reevaluate how they treat talent and what really leads to productivity, and I think the smart ones are doing that now, then we'll see that you can have the best of both worlds, a flexible workforce that is also engaged. The last thing I note on the company side, you're seeing more companies talk about hiring skills. And that's the recognition that, a company can wait 3-6 months to find the perfect candidate, or they can hire someone with the potential in the next 3 to 6 months to become the perfect employee. And the great thing about the latter is that embeds loyalty to the company. So for a company who wants to retain a workforce, offering professional development and being that bridge from the old economy, service based, to this new digitized e-commerce forward economy, by providing those skills and development, is something that is a win-win for companies. I think more and more companies of all sizes are realizing that the future is developing the workforce, investing in human capital as well as technology.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess, are you also seeing some trends with companies offering more of this paid leave or sick leave that Betsy was talking about, or maybe even creating a daycare or a backup daycare through
There
their own?
has been, for companies who can, and this is somewhat of concern too, because it speaks to imbalance. For companies who can, they are offering more benefits, more bonuses. But then you have companies with already slim margins who can't expand wages, who can't offer benefits in the same way. So their kind of superpower, the tool that they can use is this flexibility, and helping where they can change their business models. There are some business models that just don't make sense anymore, and it's really time to reevaluate them. Example, the tax season and accountants. Do you really need to have people work 70 to 80 hours a week for 3 months every year? Does that make sense to anybody? Or is there a different approach? Well, if you want new women to come into the workplace, maybe you change that approach so it's not burdensome every year and you get this great result. I think companies, industries are rethinking how they've done business as usual and trying to expand their approach so it's more inclusive, yes, but also that they can support and retain their workforce.
Yeah. We've talked about why this she-cession was so unusual. We've talked about how it hit low-income workers and particularly low-income women so hard. We've talked about some encouraging signs in this recovery with women coming back, but still a long way to go. Um, Betsy, we have so many viewers of this program right now who are college students or recent graduates, young people. What would your message be to these folks just starting their careers? How can they best take advantage of the job market going forward?
So, I mean, I think I would start by saying it does help to expect more. I love the phrase "noisy backseat driver." I just love it so much. But I think that there is a role for people to speak up and say what they need, and to be, I think, to try to think hard about what it is that matters to you. And I think a lot of people did that over the pandemic. That's why we're seeing so much job change right now. And then I do think we have to not just expect more from our companies, but we have to expect more from government, and really say this is what we need. I mean, the public actually wants things like a paid leave system. They want things like affordable childcare, but you got to go to the polls and say that's the thing that's really going to matter to me. And what we see, is young people in particular. They're very busy with their lives, and so then they don't actually, get involved in that way. They don't vote at high rates. Wellesley, I think, is a little different, but I do think it's important for people to demand what it is that we need, and we definitely need to see some change.
That's a powerful takeaway. Thank you both for this really rich discussion and so many insights you provided today. Nayla, we love your phrase. We hope we are all back demanding backseat drivers in the best possible way. Thank you to Betsy. Thank you to Nayla. And please stay tuned for a wonderful discussion the rest of the day.
Welcome. It is wonderful to be here today with Claudia Goldin, who is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard. Her groundbreaking research and scholarship focuses on issues related to work, women, and family. In her most recent book, Career and Family: Women's Century-Long Journey Towards Equity, she examines how college-educated women in the United States have tried to balance the demands of work and family across different generations. And she sorts through the data to identify chief drivers of gender inequality today. I am truly delighted to have a chance to speak with Professor Goldin, who brings both informed scholarship and bold and innovative thinking to the question of what needs to change for women to achieve full equality at home and at work. Professor Goldin, welcome. It is really wonderful to have you here today. And I really want to congratulate you on this major contribution to the thinking on women's equality in the workplace. And I want to just preface this interview by saying that I think your book really should be required reading for those both in policymaking positions, in government and elsewhere, as well as by employers. And for this conversation, we've agreed to be informal and call each other by our first names. So let's begin. In your book, you describe the evolution of college-educated women's ability to balance work and family over time, and the choices they make and the barriers they face. And you divide women into a number of cohorts. Can you just begin by talking a little bit about a group that you call Group 5, that includes women who graduated from college between 1980 and 2000, of which I must say I'm a proud member? What progress have they made, and what barriers do they still face?
Certainly. So we're asking, where are we today? So group 5, the only reason that I have that end date is because I need to know what they've done. And so the end date is when they're in their 40s. But I can include a 5+, not yet a 6, for various reasons that we can talk about. So it includes lots of people who will be listening in. Don't think that you're excluded. So where are we today? So there is a desire on the part of many women, especially college graduates, for a meaningful and long-lived career. We're in the labor force for a very long time now. And also a family, which often means having children. And these two aspirations are almost always in conflict. And that's because they vie for the same time. One of the great things that equalizes all of us is that we all have 24 hours in a day. But whatever conflicts may exist today, the ability to do both in the past was just far more difficult. So we evolved from a time when college graduate women could have either a family or a career, rarely both, to now when they aspire to have both of them. So how and why change occurred is a very important part of the story. Let me just add something about the groups. Let me say just a few words about them, since you mentioned the groups. So it's convenient to think of this very, very long history, over 100 years, as having 5 distinct groups that differed in these outcomes: employment, marriage, family, career. The first group graduated around 1910. And as I just noted, it had family or career. The third group graduated around 1955, and it had family first and then a job. These two groups were completely different. The first, just 50% had children or adopted a child. And the second, 90% had children among those who married. And yet these two groups were really the same people. They were just there at different times. And the fifth group, yours, sometime after 1980, you're actually on the cusp of 4 and 5, had delayed marriage and family considerably to cement their careers. And it has achieved substantial amount of success, but the amount of success is still much lower than equivalent men.
Yeah. So, it's just fascinating, and it's a very helpful way to think about these cohorts of women. And to me, one of the really interesting chapters was the one where you dive into the pay gap and you go through the data and arrive, and I think some really a fascinating hypothesis about what you think is one of the most significant drivers of the pay gap today. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Certainly, the area of gender differences that has been getting the most attention today is the earnings gap. There are lots of different differences. And in the past, the big difference was that men were in the workforce and women were less so. Now we don't talk about that gap, but we generally express the gender earnings gap as a single number. Women get, let's say, 80 cents on the male dollar, but it is really far more complicated and it evolves over time, over a life cycle for each woman. But however it's expressed, there has been great progress in narrowing that gap, particularly in the 1980s and somewhat in the 1990s. Much of the progress came about because women's education and job experience greatly advanced relative to men's. But there's considerable frustration that there hasn't been more change in this metric. There's been outrage about sexual harassment, about biased managers. Ridding the labor market of discrimination of all types is essential. It's not just a noble goal, it's absolutely essential. But it will not make a big difference in closing the remaining gender gap in earnings. And the reason is that the remainder is largely due to the impact of what might be called greedy work and how couples adjust to it. So let me just say a few words about that. The employee who's willing to work at all hours, evenings, weekends, vacations, that person is on call at the office. They get the bigger rewards. And when these rewards are disproportionate to the amount of time put in, meaning double the hours, more than double the earnings, we get what I would call greedy work. And if a couple has children or other family care responsibilities, someone has to be on call at home, even if that person has a full-time job. And the on call at home person will take a position that has more flexibility, is less demanding, and in consequence pays less per hour.
Yeah. I think that concept is such an important one, and you shared an example in the book of Isabel and Lucas, a married couple working in the tech industry. Can you just share that, because I think it really made it real to me about what it is we're talking about greedy work and how that can lead to these inequities.
Yeah, so I've encountered many couples with very similar stories. And so what I did was I invented a representative couple. I called them Isabel and Lucas. They both graduated from the same college in the same year. They got CS degrees, computer science degrees. They joined a tech firm. They were each offered one of two jobs, either a job with regular hours that had some degree of flexibility. And let's say that at the time paid $100,000 a year, or they were offered a similar job, but it had on-call hours that they had to agree to do. They might be at night, they might be on weekends, and they might be on vacations. And that paid $130,000 a year. So initially, they both took the high-paying job, the one with the on-call hours, and they were pleased with that arrangement until they had a child. And that changed matters since both couldn't agree to be on call. Maybe one could, but both of them couldn't. They could both take the lower paying job for sure, but that would then mean that they were $60,000 poorer per year. Or they sat down and they figured out that one could take the less flexible job and one could take the more flexible job. And social norms and their conversation and maybe their parents dictated that Isabel would take the more flexible job. They saved $30,000 a year by doing that. So, but in the process, they abandoned what one might call couple equity, and they threw gender equality under the bus with it. So Isabel, after they decided that one would take one job and one would take the other, now receives 77 cents on Lucas's dollar, even though she works about the same number of hours. And let me say that even same-sex couples might do the same thing. They might they might abandon gender couple equity, but they wouldn't add to gender inequality.
Right, right. I just find it fascinating. I mean, the workplace has put a premium, right, in terms of wages on those jobs, even if it's doing similar work that really don't have the flexibility, and that's a way that work has evolved. What are the most dominant? Where is this found most often in terms of sectors, work sectors?
So the jobs are mainly those in client-facing areas, such as in finance, law, and consulting. But there are many sectors where work is more substitutable, and that's really the issue. So if you're a lawyer and you have a client and you have a partner who's a very, very good substitute, and the client feels that way, then if you're called out at 11 a.m. on a Thursday, that partner could fill in for you. But there are many sectors where work really is more substitutable among employees, such as in tech jobs, or in which teams of substitutes are actually constructed for the benefit of the employees and the clients, as in many branches of medicine. When that happens, work becomes less greedy. If there's a group of pediatricians, then when your child gets sick at a time when your usual pediatrician isn't on call, there is someone else in the group who you and your child have already met. That sort of teams of substitutes is very helpful to solve the greedy work problem. It's also very good for various clients. The same thing is true in veterinary medicine.
Right. So, I think it's so important what you're saying is that there are ways to move beyond this if we are consciously working to create kind of a workplace that is really not paying that premium, that is thinking about substitutions. Your research mainly focused on college educated women, but you do talk about non-college educated women in your book. What are your thoughts on how the challenges for the non-college educated women compare with those who have received a college degree?
So time constraints impact everyone, especially women without a college degree. So when jobs have hours and days that are unpredictable, the consequences of not following the rules set down by an employer can be even more disastrous for the individual who has fewer options. The single mom who's told to come to work at 7 a.m. and told that the day before may not be able to find a sitter on short notice. And the woman who works and goes to school may lose her job if her shift conflicts with her courses at the community college. So many states and municipalities, this was an expose that the New York Times did a few years ago, and many states and municipalities have recently passed legislation making it illegal to schedule shifts in these short run and rather unreasonable ways.
Yeah, I think just again, really important, and it does point to a path forward, which is so important. Clearly, employers have a major role to play in this, as does government. And another equally important and powerful point you make is that we need to make these changes in the workplace and changes in the nature of work, but also to achieve gender equality. Working parents or families really need to recommit to couple equity. And that is, I think, a journey to be followed. You give some brilliant examples of what happened in the pandemic in terms of the mix of work, but that the overall numbers increased, so that women were still bearing the greatest burden of care. I guess integrating that thinking into what is going to be my last question, because I really want to end here in looking at the future. At the end of the book, you talked about how the pandemic magnified the issue of gender inequality, again, exposing the unequal burden of caregiving and the importance of the care sector to our economy and to economic recovery. You talked about the silver linings it's brought in terms of increases in flexibility. So I want you to project forward. If you were writing the next edition of your book, which outlined the journey for a group 6, so it'd be women graduating from college after 2000, and that is the women who are starting in the workforce today, what do you hope it would be?
So let's talk a little bit about what we can sort of see around the corner. I'm very bad at predicting the future. I have not taken courses in being a psychic, but I do have a pretty good sense what's slightly around the corner. So one of the amazing silver linings of our now a year or more that we have spent in lockdown, now we're sort of coming out of it, is our greater ability to have more flexible jobs and the greater productivity of what we're cobbling together as these more flexible jobs. So the pandemic really does appear, we're not quite certain yet, to have lowered the cost of flexibility in various ways. So firms and workers have learned to use technologies such as the one we're using right now to enable remote meetings, including those with really large numbers of participants. If you can agree to a contract, a merger and an acquisition, for example, with a client in Tokyo, or sign a contract in Beijing without ever getting on a plane, that is much better for the parent who needs to be home at night. That parent can now take that job. That was the job that Isabel couldn't take. So, or Lucas couldn't take it. One of them couldn't take it, but it was Isabel who didn't take it. But now these are the really high-end jobs that, and very satisfying jobs, and jobs that are going to last your lifetime, that women can take, people with care responsibilities. And care responsibilities, of course, are not just children, they're adults as well. So if that's the case, the parent who needs to be home at night can take that job, and that individual is likely to be a woman right now. And the number of hours may remain the same, but the employee has more control over which hours are free, just like the ones before the child goes to bed or when the family eats dinner together. But we have to be careful that we haven't set up a circumstance in which, and let's say at the law firm, that only the women are the ones who work from home and the men get together and they get the better clients. So we have to guard against creating female enclaves or a new mummy track. Right. So part-time work was bad for corrosive of various careers, although it did give a certain amount of flexibility. We don't want the this other option also to be corrosive of careers for women and put them in a new type of enclave. It's the sense of most people looking at the data right now that men also want this type of both temporal and geographic flexibility, but we don't know what the new normal is going to be.
Well, Claudia, Professor Goldin, thank you. Thank you for this really such a major contribution to our thinking on this critically important topic. as I said earlier, I could really spend the next hour at least talking with you about all the various aspects of your work and the different how you're thinking about different industries. It's really phenomenal. But thank you so much, and it was truly a pleasure.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Paula, to meet you.
Hi, Representative Clark. It's an honor to meet you. Always an honor to meet your representative. Thank you so much for joining us for Wellesley Summit.
Well, Taryn, I am so thrilled to be here with you. It is great to meet you, and I'm so glad to be part of this conversation on the economy that she deserves.
All right, let's jump in. So my first question is, how has the pandemic disproportionately affected women, and especially women of color in the workforce?
Well, Taryn, we know the pandemic pulled back the curtain on a systemic inequities that have always been built into our economy. So when schools closed their doors, it was women who stayed home. When childcare centers shuttered, it was women who left their jobs. When the coronavirus impacted millions of seniors, often sick, it was women who took care of them. And for women who want to continue working and pay for care, high costs and unequal wages locked many out of that choice. The economy simply isn't built for women because it wasn't built by women. We have a failing childcare sector, a failing senior care sector, no national paid family leave policies, and an economy that continues to undervalue women-led industries like nursing, teaching, and caregiving. And these inequities have created what we call the she-cession. And despite our incredible recovery on so many different metrics, 7 million jobs created, lowest unemployment since 1952, and the fastest economic growth in 4 decades, too many women and therefore families are not feeling this effect. So we know that this has been especially hard for women of color. While overall unemployment this month continues to fall, for Latinas, it's still close to 5% unemployment. And unemployment for Black women actually went up to a staggering 6.1%. And frankly, our economy has always been built on the backs of unpaid or poorly paid women. So my optimism is that we have a historic number of women in power who are calling out these inequities, making it a priority, and taking action. So from Vice President Harris to Speaker Pelosi to a record number of women in Congress, we will not sit on the sidelines. We are taking action.
Thank you. Well, as you mentioned, the pandemic has exacerbated worker shortages, and it's been shown that women are taking time off work to fill in the gap for services like childcare and school bus drivers. So what can be done about these major shortages?
Well, we can start by investing in these positions like the critical economic infrastructure they are. We took a historic step with the American Rescue Plan, which put $50 billion into childcare relief funding. And this money supported childcare providers and educators, 96% of whom are women, and the majority of whom are women of color. So we help save the childcare industry, but we know it's not enough. Like so many of the jobs you just listed, childcare providers on average make $12 an hour. Just think about that. Childcare providers who are caring for our children aren't making enough to care for their own children. MIT has estimated that a living wage for a mom with 2 children in Cambridge is $36 an hour, 3 times the average for childcare providers. And this is repeated across many essential workers. And, so when we're talking about caregiving, whether it's home care or childcare, we have to invest in these jobs and in these women. And if we do that, not only is that going to be better for them, but it is going to make our recovery more robust and more long-term. So we know that the answer is to make an investment. Wage increases coupled with paid leave policies are going to really make our recovery one that is lasting and brings equality and relief to women.
Another reason women take time off work to serve as unpaid caregivers is because of unaffordable long-term care. I found the number, the average cost of semi-private room in a long-term care facility in Massachusetts this year is $151,000 per year. So I'm wondering, how can we make long-term care more accessible to the average American and the average family?
Yeah, long-term care is one of those benefits that people so need. And, I discovered this personally with my own parents. When my mom had Alzheimer's, my dad had suffered a significant stroke, and trying to find for them that care and affordability was something that we really struggled with. And it was very difficult to make sure that I was able to meet their needs. And this experience is not unique. So many other women know that push and pull of trying to care for family members and balancing work responsibilities. So again, it goes back to making those investments, seeing long-term care, seeing women's role as caretakers and as members of a workforce is something that we need to address and grapple with and make those investments because it is good for everybody.
My mom is actually a CFP, and she's been telling me that almost every single woman that she's worked with over her last 27 years has had lower Social Security benefits because they took years off work to care for children and family members. So I'm wondering how Social Security retirement benefits can be more fair to unpaid caregivers.
Well, you're absolutely right. Social Security doesn't pay caregivers directly, but if they are a primary caregiver of someone with a disability benefits through Social Security, those benefits can be used to help cover costs related to that care. So I have co-sponsored legislation that would create caregiver credits so that individuals aren't penalized in retirement for taking time out of the workforce to care for kids or other dependents. We have to be creative about the ways we address the high costs of caregiving. So let's explore every avenue to help support women and moms.
Wow, I hadn't heard of that. Thank you. So how has the current encroachment on reproductive rights affected women economically?
Yeah, it's quite a lineup of challenges for women. And in the last decade, we have seen state lawmakers push nearly 500 restrictive laws that make abortion difficult or even impossible to access. And we know that this is about power and control over women, our bodies, and our choices. So what is Congress to do? Pass a bill I co-sponsored, the Women's Health Protection Act. This bill codifies the constitutional right to abortion, helping counter the restrictive and punitive laws that are being passed in states across the country. Just some examples are forcing women to make unnecessary in-person visits to a doctor, which can require time off and money to travel, requiring providers to give unscientific or non-medical advice, or a draconian new bounty hunter laws like we've seen in Texas. This is why it's so important to get involved in our elections, from local elections to state legislatures to US senators who confirm federal judges. Affordable health care, paid family leave, economic stability, accessible childcare, all these basic human dignities that are too far out of reach for too many American women and families. We can't let this continue, and we cannot turn the clock back. We need to fight for the right for abortion, fight for the right for reproductive care broadly, and family first policies that empower women across this economy.
Something else that we saw increase over the last 2 years during this pandemic is violence against women. How can the reauthorized Violence Against Women Act be strengthened to address this?
Well, I was very pleased to be at the White House a few weeks ago for the signing of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. But it is outrageous that Republicans blocked this because they wanted to make sure that abusers could still buy a gun. So in 2018, 19, 20, 21, all of this was blocked because of this one cruel and dangerous issue. Before the pandemic, we know that 1 in 3 women reported having experienced violence from an intimate partner. And as you pointed out, COVID-19 saw that number rise even higher. But due to public health requirements to stay home, many victims lost their ability to escape. And the stress of the pandemic saw abusers attack more frequently and more violently. The hotline has reported a surge in calls after March of 2020 when the pandemic took root in our country. And rape crisis centers have also reported increased calls. Locally, here at Brigham and Women's Hospital, they saw a spike of patients with injuries due to intimate partner violence. And it is a priority of the Democrats that VAWA be reauthorized. And we are so glad that we were able to do that in the budget just a few weeks ago. And we were able to expand tribal courts' jurisdiction to cover non-Indigenous abusers. We strengthened the criminal and civil laws for cyber crimes. We increased funding, resources, and training for first responders who deal with victims of gender-based and sexual violence. And we increased the funding to many grant programs that are already in place. And I was excited that some of my provisions were included. That includes training grants for prosecutors, 911 operators, and judges on cyber crimes so they have a greater understanding of the true threat that cyber crimes can be. And we required AGs to come up with a national strategy to combat cyber crimes and required that the FBI update their criminal reporting database to better track how often these crimes are happening. The next step that Congress needs to take is to listen to the experts, to survivors, to the data, and make sure that we continue to refine, improve, and strengthen VAWA as we move forward.
Thank you. My final question is about something near and dear to my heart, the Equal Rights Amendment. Can the National Archivist finish the process of formally adding the ERA to the Constitution?
Well, political and legal challenges to the ratification process have to be resolved before the ERA can be published with certification of its ratification. That's set forth in the Constitution. The ERA has officially met that standard in Article 5 of the Constitution, that an amendment is valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of several states. So that's the requirement. And in January of 2020, DOJ, under Attorney General William Barr, contended that the ERA was dead because its time limit had expired. And supporters of the ERA, like me, and I think you, have argued that Article 5 gives no role in the constitutional amendment process to the executive branch, and that DOJ's opinion is not binding on the legislative branch. But with a new president and a new head of DOJ, these cases are ongoing and subject to change. So these legal issues are working their way through the courts. So I don't have a concrete timeline for you, but I can tell you this: we are committed and still advocating for the remaining 12 states to pass the ERA and enshrine equality into law. It is so far past time that we do this, and I think that we are very close to success.
That is so great to hear. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. We are here to talk about building a caregiving infrastructure with three awesome panelists. First, we're joined by Kristen Butcher, Director of the Center on Children and Families at Brookings, and the Marshall I. Goldman Professor of Economics at Wellesley College. Sari Kerr, Senior Research Scientist at the Wellesley Centers for Women and Lecturer in Economics at Wellesley College, and Shauna Olney, former Chief of the Gender, Equality, and Diversity Branch of the International Labor Organization. And I'm Emma Hinchliff, an editor at Fortune magazine and author of our newsletter, The Broadsheet, which is born about the world's most powerful women. Thank you to the three of you for joining us today. So to start, I'd love to start with a discussion of caregiving is obviously a huge factor in the economic inequality that women face. How did this change during the pandemic? Sari, maybe we can start with you and what you've seen play out with childcare, especially.
Thank you. This is not just pandemic specific, obviously, but if we look at most families, we see that one of the parents takes the role of being the primary caregiver. And often the other parent has the role of having the primary career. And this, even in two working parent families, there tends to be some separation that gets defined by things like whose occupation pays better, whose job is able to handle more flexibility, and so on. And so it's always been the case that women take more of a role in being the primary caregiver and doing a lot more at home and with the children. And when the pandemic hit, then certainly, if anything, that exacerbated the difference between men and women, and mothers and fathers. In most families, everyone amped up their caregiving responsibilities during the pandemic, but it was even more felt by women. So even if men stepped in doing more, since everyone was home, especially initially, the gap between men and women grew, and that was not something that was unexpected. It was very much to be expected that was going to take place.
Yeah, thank you. Kristen, what about in elder care?
So I don't know so much how it was changed during the pandemic. We do know that people in institutions were disproportionately affected by COVID-19. I think 1 in 6 deaths in the United States were people in an institutional setting. And we do also know that, as in childcare, daughters are disproportionately likely to be providing help to their elderly parents. And I know we're all focused on the pandemic, but we should be focused on the coming 20 years as well, because the baby boom generation, born from 1946 to 1964, I'm not a boomer, by the way. I just miss it. But there are 72 million people in that category. And so by 2050, the census projects that 8.4% of the US will be 80 or older. Currently, only the 3 oldest counties in Florida have that age structure. So the US is going to look like the oldest county in Florida you've ever been to. And there are just going to be so many caregiving needs. I think that policy needs to get ready to address that question.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot of points that we can definitely dive into throughout this session. But first, Shauna, would love to hear from you about a bit of an international perspective on some of what we saw with caregiving over the past 2 years.
Thanks, Emma. And it's really an honor to be on this panel with these wonderful panelists as well. And this issue couldn't be more relevant. I think, as others have already said, this is not just about the pandemic, but the pandemic was an important moment to give visibility to what had been invisible. And I think it is a crucial moment, and one that we really can harness. And I'll come back to that in the discussion. So if we want to understand the economic impact of the pandemic on women, all roads lead back to care. And I think others have already made that point. The majority of people's income statistically comes from paid work. Okay, so if we're talking about economic impact, we're talking about work, the world of work. Now, we saw a decline in jobs, and there was a lot of visibility about the Great Resignation, I think was what we saw in the papers a lot. And most of the people who were leaving were women. It was really a feminized exodus from the workforce, and care was the big reason for that. So I think that was, that made the headlines. It was very important that we saw that. So we saw in the pandemic that the fragility of the care infrastructure, both the unpaid and paid care infrastructure. So it's a continuum. So we saw that when the paid care infrastructure broke down, then it all went back to the unpaid, and it fell on women. Women were 4 to 5 times more likely to have increased care responsibilities at home during the pandemic, so globally. We also saw that globally, in the first 18 months of the pandemic, 3% of men's employment was destroyed, compared to over 4% of women's, and that's millions of jobs. So the economic impact on women was huge. And again, a lot of women were saying they left the workforce, they had to make that choice, whether they stayed in jobs or they came home, because of the absence of the care infrastructure. So this is an important moment. It shows how important care is at home, how important care is in terms of paid care jobs, and how those are inextricably linked. Now, just a couple of statistics here, and this is some work we did in the ILO a few years ago. If paid and unpaid work are combined, women work longer hours than men, and that was before COVID. And then that, I think, as others have said, that was exacerbated during COVID. In 2018, 600 million women compared to 40 million men declared themselves unavailable for employment or not seeking a job due to unpaid care responsibilities. Again, that went up, but it was already huge. And then just one last figure that I find extraordinary. Before COVID, over 16 billion hours were spent in unpaid care work every day. Now think about that. That's the equivalent of 2 billion people working 8 hours a day for free, and 75% of those were women. So I think that puts the whole COVID situation into perspective. The problems were already there.
Yeah, and Shauna, I think, obviously we hear these numbers and the impact of the pandemic. It's these numbers about women leaving the workforce and the toll of unpaid care work. But, I think you've also done a little bit of work on kind of the more human side of this. So why does work matter to women? And, what is the effect on, each individual person who is maybe forced out of the workforce, not by choice?
There's some interesting surveys that were done. Gallup's done some surveys. In the ILO, we did one with Gallup, which was, I think, quite important. We asked women around the world what was important to them in the world of work. So did they want to stay at home and look after the family? Did they want to work in paid jobs? Did they want to do both? Now, if you put working in paid jobs and doing both together, the majority of women in every single region want to work in paid jobs. So I think that was really important, because we had been hearing a lot, well, you don't understand, in our region, women don't really want to work, it's not in our culture, but actually they do in every single region of the world. Now, if we look at the statistics for Canada and the US, US I think was about 78%, Canada was 81%, and there are countries where that's even higher. So women want to work in paid jobs. So I think that was important. And then we look at these life evaluation surveys of Gallup as well, and we see that women working in paid jobs actually evaluate their life higher. If you look at the scale of life evaluation, so they see themselves as thriving, and that I think is really important. And then if you look at one of the surveys during COVID, the women who suffered the most were women with small children who were also trying to work. It was really, really difficult for them. So, paid work is really important to women, but there's this constant pressure. If the care infrastructure breaks down, the stress comes onto them, and we saw that in very real terms in the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, so these kinds of gaps for women who are forced out of the workforce in this way, what effect do those career gaps have on women who end up taking them?
Thank you. That's a very nice question. So we've looked at a lot of those pay gaps across women's lives, sort of contrasting women at the start of their working careers, and then when family formation begins for some women, and perhaps others will not have a family, how that looks like compared to men over the age life cycle, the career life cycle, and the family life cycle. And we see, and especially if we look at college-educated women, that the men and women start their work very similar looking, like they choose roughly similar types of jobs. There's certainly some jobs that women flock more into and men flock less into, and there's some pay gaps between the jobs. But if we just look within job, men and women start on a roughly equal footing. And then within the next 10 years, or the first 10 years in the job, men's earnings increase quite significantly, tremendously. And by the time, let's say, we started looking at 25-year-olds, the 35-year-olds, the gap has grown quite massive, and it continues growing up until to the early 40s of the individual. And all of that growth in the gender earnings gap appears to come from married individuals, specifically individuals who choose to have children. So if we look at unmarried men and unmarried women, not much happens there. If we look at non-college educated individuals, there's some growth in there, but it's really among the college educated men and women who enter into forming families. And then some of the work that we've recently done really digs into what happens at different stages of the family life cycle. The young children are extremely costly for women's careers. They reduce their working hours significantly. Even if they stay working, they work a lot less than the dads do. So mothers work less than dads do, and that has both a hit in terms of contemporaneous earnings. So their earnings start stagnating quite significantly, and then also dynamically that earnings impact or that sort of taking time off, working less during the key years when you really need to be focusing on your career, then that doesn't help you later. So missing promotions, missing job changes that would have led to bigger earnings increases down the road, you miss on all of those. And it turns out that that earnings gap between moms and dads is enormous by the time kids are in their teens. Now there might be actually time to do something, go back and work more, but it's hard to kind of fully step back in. So we actually see that moms and dads continue having that gap even after kids leave home.
Yeah, thank you. That is definitely important to note as we consider the impact of this problem. Kristen, you mentioned that we should really be looking at the next 20 years and not just back at the last 2 or the last 10. So what impact do you see these kind of confluence of issues having in the next 20 years, whether, some of your work on elder care and the impact of that aging baby boomer population, or some of these other problems like childcare and our lack of a national childcare infrastructure?
Yeah, those are the big issues, I think, facing women as we go forward. So there's work out of Austria, a really nice paper. The Europeans tend to have much better data than we do, really integrated. So work by Frimmel et al. Is able to link what happens when a elderly parent has a dramatic health event, a stroke, for example, and then what happens to children's labor supply. And they find a significant reduction in adult children's labor supply, particularly for women, and particularly for people who are nearby. So if you think about what's happening as the baby boom ages, you're going to start to see health care needs and caregiving needs increase really dramatically. So just to throw out some figures, at 65, about 4% of people say that they have some difficulties with self-care. But by the time people get to 90, that's 40%. So we're going to see tremendous increases in the number of people who just have real challenges with activities of daily living. How are we going to handle those things? Most elderly, 87%, not surprisingly, say they would prefer to age in place or age in community rather than going into some kind of an institution. Probably that's increased since the pandemic because of the issues that how dangerous those places were and how lonely during the pandemic. Many people, I'm sure, are quite afraid for themselves and for their loved ones. What we have found in our work is that over the last 20, 30 years, in places where there were more immigrants, the elderly are less likely to be institutionalized. Right? So we're going to have these increasing caregiving needs. People may or may not be able to manage at home. Where there are more immigrants, they seem to be able to manage at home better. And other work by Delia Furtado and her co-author Francesca Ortega have found that in places where there are more immigrants, those people who go into nursing homes also have better outcomes. And a plausible mechanism is that it's just, there's just much more plentiful labor to provide the kinds of services that people need as they age. So one of the things we're really interested in is that a policy that could be used to address these future caregiving needs?
Yeah, well, I mean, the experience of care workers is certainly an important part of this conversation. Both the labor supply, as you mentioned, as well as the the way those workers are paid for their work, whether it's good quality work or low paid work. I think we have a good understanding of the problem now, so I would love to talk a little bit more about solutions. If you each had to pick, let's say, one governmental policy to address some of these problems and one employer-based policy to address some of these problems, which two would you choose? Maybe, sorry if you want to start.
That's mean to limit us to only one, because some of the things I think but I'll start. So I think the government policy we do need certainly is paid family leave, and not just paid family leave as it exists now in certain states that already have implemented it, but trying to think about it much broadly and how it could work for both mom and dad, and also for the employer firm. So US is really behind pretty much any country you can think of in terms of provision of paid family leave. And then for maybe it comes as a surprise to some people, policymakers, that kids actually are enormous amount of work when they are first born. So it is not feasible to work with a newborn. We need a generously supported paid family leave. We can think about how that should be paid. Maybe the unemployment insurance type system that's already in place in places like California could work. The problem with the current format, though, is that it's mostly moms who take it. So we need to move more towards a policy that encourages equal use by the parents. So it's not just one parent, because that'll again have the same kind of repercussions later if it's just one parent taking it. So it's something like that. Sweden has been successful in getting through that cultural norm change where dads actually do take significant amount of the parental leave. So something similar needs to happen. And it needs to be longer in length than what we currently have. So at 12 weeks, what is a typical length of a parental leave, infants are not self-sufficient. You can't just leave them and go to work. Something needs to happen after that as well. And I think that's probably where firms could do more. So firms, if they want to have their employees back, need to think about how they can actually manage that work-family connection. So something needs to be done. There's been successful examples in the US, like even during the World War, where we did have daycare that was provided, and it was provided near the employer. We've seen successful examples of some employers actually providing daycare and making it much more possible to work and have your child in the daycare. So this could be something, again, that maybe the society can encourage. The government could have ways in which they can reimburse some of the costs to the employer firm, but those would be my two picks. I'd like to have more, but limit myself to that.
Yeah, Shauna, what about you? And if there's some overlap, maybe you could give us an alternative so we can get more than two ideas on the table.
Excellent idea, and I agree. Having only two is difficult, but I think the points that Sari made are really important. And just to add on to that, we see there's a direct correlation between access to early childhood education and care and women's labor force participation. So, and it correlates across a range of countries. So the more investment as well that a country puts in early childhood education and care, again, the higher the women's labor force participation. Now, the problem you have in most countries is that there's a gap of about 4 years between when you come off maternity leave or other types of leave and when you then have state provided, whether it's pre-primary or primary. So that's the period where women fall out of the labor market, and that's a key period. So providing early childhood education in that period is really important. Canada has just recently announced that they're providing $10 a day childcare, and that's going to be huge. And that didn't come out of the blue. I mean, there was already this had already been done in Quebec in the 90s. And you saw immediately an increase in women in employment, and you saw a decrease in poverty. So that period is extremely important. So I want the leave piece, and I think Sari got to put that in, and now I'm going for the early childhood education. But I think the leave provision for the employers is also really important. And again, Sari was saying, not in a way that makes it just all about the mother, that it's only the mother's responsibility. You have to make sure that the fathers also have a role. And if you have leave that is transferable, so say you've got the mother and the father who are both in the same workplace, and you say, well, between you can share this 3 months, 6 months, whatever, the majority will be taken by women. And in fact, almost all of it will be taken by women statistically. So men have to have this use it or lose it piece. Otherwise, they will not take it. So that's the only thing that's proved, including in the Scandinavian countries, to really be effective to get fathers on board. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And Kristen, what about you?
So I want us to keep in mind that not only are women caregivers in the elder care world, they're also going to be care recipients, and a disproportionate share of those as well. And I think we as women would like our elderly selves to be provided with adequate, dignified care as we age. And these things are tricky because in something like household services, just somebody helping with the activities of daily living in your home, prices are very close to wages in those. And so we might all say we would like the women who are disproportionately providing those services to get paid a decent wage, but the wages they are paid translate almost instantaneously into the prices that are paid by the people receiving the care. And so I think the only role is for government to fill that gap between the two of those things, right? And so understanding how to make that happen, I think, is going to be one of the challenges of the next 20 to 30 years. This paper that I keep referencing from Frimmel et al. In Austria, they did find that when Austria liberalized its immigration policies to allow more foreign-born care workers in, the impact of a parent's health crisis on the adult children's labor supply was muted significantly. And so that suggests that that is a potential lever to pull.
Yeah, thank you. So more than 2, 3, 4 great policy ideas. So thank you all for sharing that. Shauna, on that topic, what is the link between the working conditions for care workers in the workforce and the quality of that care?
Thanks, Emma. I think that's a really important question because the work we did in 2018 with the International Labor Organization on care work and care jobs showed very clearly that, and perhaps it's no surprise to any of us, but it was good to have the data behind it, that if you have good terms and conditions of employment for care workers, so we're talking about health, education, social work, you will have a better quality of care. Let's say that seems perhaps obvious, but I think it was important to have that finding. If you want your parents to have good quality care, if you want your children to have good quality care, we have to invest in those care jobs. And as Kirsten was saying, the costs for individuals are getting out of hand. So they have to be publicly provided. Now, what we found in a new survey, and this is a legal survey that's just come out from the ILO on the 8th of March, you have, in terms of long-term care, so for aging societies, it's only provided in 55 countries, and it's paid in only 34 countries. So in terms of public provision, so that's pretty limited. In terms of the child care, between 0 and 2, you have a very few countries that provide that. And then between 2 and 5, you have more countries, but still a lot of the costs are being put on the individual, making it untenable. Now, in this new survey that the ILO has done, they've also done some modeling, and they've looked at what would be the benefits of investing in the care economy. So if you invest in these care jobs, and these good care jobs, so we want to see people paid properly. And we saw what happened during COVID when they're low paid, they're precarious workers, they're working in difficult conditions. We saw how difficult that was. But we could actually create 300 million more jobs by 2035 by investing properly in the care economy. Otherwise, there's going to be a care crisis. And we've already seen that in COVID. COVID's not necessarily going to be the only pandemic we face, but there'll also be a care crisis because of the aging economies and because of other demographic factors. So we need to be ready for that, and we need to invest in the care economy. We need to do it now. Thank you.
Yeah, obviously we do live in a country where politics play a big role in which of these policies might actually turn into reality. Which of these ideas do you think have the best chance of making it to the public, and which would you say is the most crucial to put into place as soon as possible? Kristen, I see you nodding. Maybe you have some thoughts.
There's a reason I didn't go into politics. I do not know what is the most likely one to get traction. But I think that we just need to keep telling people that this crisis is here and it's not going to get better without some intervention and providing evidence to that. I think that the public is not as far away from wanting policy action as the government is from providing it. And so I think that we need to keep highlighting that as well.
And is that a shift you've seen? Do you think the public sentiment on these policies has changed over the past 10 years, 5 years, 2 years?
I do. I mean, I think that, my generation had kids late. And so we're seeing people who have 80-year-old parents and 10-year-old kids, right? And they are feeling it excruciatingly, this pinch and the needs for caregiving. And it's not just about themselves. They can see that the people they're responsible for need more investment and more support in them for their children to go on and lead, happy, healthy lives. We need to be investing in kids. For the elders to have dignified ends of life experiences, we need more caregiving.
Yeah. Sorry, what about you?
No, I agree. You can see that some of the attitudes are changing, and even though it feels so slow in terms of the paid leave, more and more states have actually now taken that step. And Christine and I are looking at some of the earliest paid leave reforms in different states and trying to understand what they do to employer firms. Because oftentimes it's not that people are opposed to providing paid leave for parents of infants. I think most people would say, well, that seems like we should have that. The concern is always about what's going to happen to small businesses and to employer firms who have to somehow survive for a few weeks when these parents are gone, maybe even pay for some of it. So that's kind of where I think we come from. We try to provide evidence that'll help understand, are there negative impacts, and if not, like maybe that actually gives us more room to move. It's firms are not getting destroyed. My guess is that they're not going to get destroyed because we see firms in other countries surviving much more generous policies, and we see firms in the United States providing paid leave even when they're not being mandated. So guess is that it should be fine, but at least we can look at it and try to show some of those impacts.
Well, that's certainly a good outlook to have for the potential impact if we actually get these policies into place. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today, and thank you for a great conversation on caregiving.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Hello and welcome to the Economy She Deserves Summit. My name is Giselle Mota and I am the president of college government at Wellesley College. It is my pleasure to introduce Hello and welcome to the Economy She Deserves Summit. My name is Giselle Mota and I am the president of college government at Wellesley College. It is my pleasure to introduce two senators from different sides of the aisle in different parts of the country who are working on issues important to women and working families. Senator Joni Ernst is a former military officer and the current junior United States Senator for Iowa, a seat she has held since 2015. A native of Red Oak, Iowa, Senator Ernst served in the military for more than 2 decades before entering into politics. In November of 2014, she made history becoming the first woman elected to serve in federal elected office from the state of Iowa and the first female combat veteran elected to serve in the United States Senate. Since 2009, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand has served as the junior United States Senator from New York, Born and raised in upstate New York, in 2006, she was elected to the United States House of Representatives to represent New York's 20th Congressional District, where she served for 2 terms. In 2009, when then Senator Hillary Clinton was appointed U.S. Secretary of State, she was appointed to the U.S. Senate, becoming the only second woman to represent New York in the Senate. In the Senate, Senators Ernst and Gillibrand both serve on the Armed Services Committee, where they have worked together to craft legislation designed to prevent military sexual assaults and hold perpetrators accountable. Their bill, the Military Justice Improvement and Increasing Prevention Act, has been co-sponsored by more than 60 senators and by more than 200 members of the House of Representatives, and has received significant support from major veterans groups. Senator Ernst has recently introduced legislation that would make diapers an allowable expense for health flex spending and health savings accounts, which would greatly benefit working families. Senator Gillibrand is currently working to pass bills that would raise the minimum wage, make quality childcare more affordable, and ensure equal pay for equal work. In 2021, she introduced the Family Act, which, if passed, would create a national paid leave program for all American workers. We are grateful to both Senators Ernst and Gillibrand for being a part of our summit, and with them, I turn it over to them.
Hi, folks. This is Senator Joni Ernst, Junior Senator for the great state of Iowa. It's so great to be part of today's event on such an important topic. We know that COVID-19 placed extraordinary challenges on so many Americans, and sadly, women were among the hardest hit by the economic fallout from the pandemic. After years of progress, including increasing earnings and presence in boardrooms and as business leaders, job loss, school closures, and other impacts of the pandemic threatened to stall women's progress in both our business community and economy as a whole. That's why, as a senior member of the Senate Small Business Committee, I've worked on a number of efforts to support moms, women-owned small businesses, and working families in Iowa and across the country. One issue I've long focused on in a bipartisan way is childcare. Even before the pandemic, my home state of Iowa was already facing a childcare crisis with more than 700,000 Iowans living in a childcare desert, and our state losing more than 40% of its regulated childcare providers since 2012. And unfortunately, Iowa is not alone. We know we need to do more to expand opportunities for new child care facilities. That's why I've teamed up with Democratic Senator Jackie Rosen of Nevada on legislation to allow nonprofit child care providers to utilize capital access programs offered by the Small Business Administration, or SBA. This bipartisan effort is a common sense fix that takes existing programs and allows them to be used to help child care providers, which will in turn help give our working parents greater access to quality and affordable care for their kids. By improving child care access, we can help prevent more women and men from having to make the difficult choice between their career and caring for their children. We also know that women-owned small businesses were hit especially hard by the economic impacts of the pandemic. One way small businesses can be supported is through contracts from the federal government. For decades, our nation's small businesses have provided critical goods and services to the federal government, helped build stronger supply chains, created high-paying jobs, and increased access to innovation in the private sector. That's why I helped lead a bipartisan effort that directs the SBA to conduct a study on women-owned small businesses' participation in federal contracts. Sadly, the SBA has only met its goal of awarding 5% of all federal contracts to women-owned small businesses twice since 1994. We need to do more to improve access to contracting opportunities for all women-owned small businesses to both empower women, but also improve our economy. Recently, I introduced the Empowering Women in Small Business Act to increase access to venture capital financing for women-owned small businesses and hold federal agencies accountable for meeting federal contracting obligations for women-owned small businesses. It also requires a report from these agencies on the impact of inflation and supply chain shortages on women-owned small businesses over the last 3 years. I'm hopeful this bill will receive support from both Democrats and Republicans. Another issue that is a priority for me is paid parental leave. As the mother of a sweet daughter, I know how important it is to spend time with our loved ones during those first few weeks of life. I've put forward a proposal with Senator Mike Lee from Utah called the Cradle Act to offer a paid parental leave solution without government mandates, without increasing taxes on individuals or businesses, and without adding to our national debt. I believe it's long overdue that our nation modernize family leave policies and remove barriers preventing parents from balancing work and raising a family. And I will continue working with members of both parties on a solution to come to the aid of our working moms and dads across the nation. I'd like to thank you all again for the opportunity to share a few words today. In Congress, I will work with anyone to solve the issues facing my fellow women and ensure we can continue to break barriers and pave paths for the next generation. We can all get behind the idea of more women serving in elected office, as CEOs, as soldiers, as engineers and manufacturers, and in any other profession in our society. We are a better nation because of the contributions of women in all walks of life, in all fields of service, and in both chambers of Congress. And it's important to continue to remind folks of just that. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by thanking President Johnson for inviting me to join you today. And thank you to everyone at Wellesley, Spelman, and King's Colleges who helped put this summit together. I know with a collection of researchers, policymakers, business leaders, and advocates gathered together, we will find solutions to the challenges we face and build the economy every woman deserves. Over the last 2 years, school closures, childcare closures, job losses, changing work schedules, and health emergencies created new challenges for families every day. And when someone needed to stay home with kids who were sick or learning remotely, it was overwhelmingly women. If those women didn't have access to paid leave through their employer, they often had no choice but to leave their job entirely. Our lack of a national paid leave policy contributed to more than 5 million women losing their jobs in the first year of the pandemic. Nearly every single worker will need paid leave at some point, whether they are dealing with another pandemic or a personal emergency. But right now, nearly 8 in 10 workers in America don't have it. We have to recognize that workers are people first, people who get sick, have babies, adopt children, and need to care for their children or aging parents. We force them to leave their babies when they are just days old. They can't nurse them and they can't bond with them. And they can't even put them into childcare because they are too young. That's why I will continue to fight for my legislation, the Family Act, which would provide 12 weeks of paid family and medical leave to every worker for every type of emergency. That would end the shameful days of forcing working people to make an impossible choice between their family and their paycheck. A universal paid leave program will provide stability in times of national and personal emergencies by helping people keep their jobs and their health insurance at the moment they need it most. Paid leave is good for families, good for businesses, and good for the economy, and I will keep fighting for it. But paid leave alone will not solve the problems families are facing. We must fight to make high-quality childcare affordable and accessible, to provide support to the care workers who support so many families, and to reinstate the expanded child tax credit. We have been reminded every day that the system is not working for women or working families. In order for women to pursue the careers and lives that they want, we have to build a care infrastructure that supports them and their families. I will keep working until we build it. And I'm so glad to know that all of you will be working alongside me. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your conference.
Hello, and thank you for joining day one of the Economy She Deserves Summit. My name is Chandler Nuttall, and I am currently the Secretary of Academic Affairs for the Spelman Student Government Association. I am also the 81st SSGA President-elect and a member of the Spelman College class of 2023. It is my pleasure to introduce Representative Nikema Williams. Representative Williams currently serves as the United States Representative from Georgia's 5th District, which she has held since January of last year, and which was previously represented by the civil rights icon John Lewis for more than 3 decades until his death in July of 2020. Representative Williams hails from a long line of organizers. Her father was a neighborhood leader in their community, and her great aunt, Autherine Lucy, was the first African-American student to attend the University of Alabama in 1956. Throughout her political and professional career, Representative Williams has served as a fierce advocate for social justice and for women and families. In Congress, she continues to uplift the legacy of her mentor and predecessor, Congressman Lewis, by fighting to prevent voter suppression and to expand access to the ballot box. Representative Williams recently sponsored a bill intended to increase access to affordable childcare, together with Alaska Republican Don Young, who died on March 18th. At the time of this recording, it is scheduled for a vote on the House floor. We are so grateful to Representative Williams for being a part of our summit. And with that, I turn it over to her.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much, Chandler, for that introduction, and thank you to Spelman, Wellesley, and the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for the invitation. Y'all, I am Congresswoman Nikema Williams, and I proudly serve Georgia's 5th Congressional District. Building an economy that works for everyone is at the top of my to-do list in Congress, so I'm delighted to join you for the Economy She Deserves Summit. There's no question that the last 2 years have been difficult for everyone. COVID-19 exposed deep economic inequities that have existed for far too long. Throughout the pandemic, women remained on the front lines in our homes, our schools, our retail industry, and our hospitals. Women, and women of color especially, turned the wheels of society and our economy to care for our families. At the same time, the impacts of the pandemic hit women the hardest. Many who didn't lose their jobs were forced to leave the workforce because of caregiving responsibilities. Others saw a decline in household income. And as with nearly all the challenges we face, women of color faced the worst impacts. So much of what we're seeing in the pandemic's economic impact on women is directly tied to our need for a robust care economy. Care, be it child care, senior care, or disability care, makes all other work possible. We need to know that our loved ones are safe and cared for in order to get to work. I know this firsthand as the working mama of my 6-year-old son, Carter. My ability to work for the people in Congress is dependent on making sure that my Carter Cakes has safe care each and every day. Just earlier this week, I visited Our House, a child care center in my district that serves families experiencing homelessness and housing instability. One of the providers told me that during the height of the pandemic, a parent told her that she needed her to reopen because, and I quote, "Corona may kill me, but poverty definitely will if I can't go to work and provide for my family." Y'all, hearing words like that keep me clear-eyed in my mission to make sure that care is accessible to every family. Investments in a care infrastructure serve our economy twofold. They ensure families can attain the services they need and ensure that care workers are paid a fair wage for the essential work that they do. Care is a pillar of a functioning economy. People from every sector rely on care services. Just this week, the House passed legislation that I sponsored based on the simple fact that care is an economic development strategy. When we help people return to work, we help them provide for their families and invigorate the economy. And when we do get more women back to work, I'm fighting to make sure that they're paid fairly. Though pay discrimination has been illegal since 1963, women still are not paid equally for equal work. On average, women still earn just 82 cents for every dollar that a white man makes. The inequities get worse as you break it down by race. On average, a Black woman will earn $1 million less over her lifetime. And that's why last summer, on Black Women's Equal Pay Day, I introduced H.R. 4934, the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. This legislation would reestablish the National Equal Pay Enforcement Task Force to strengthen enforcement of equal pay laws already on the books. The House passed this bill actually twice, but it is currently stalled in the US Senate. So if you're looking for a homework assignment, call your senators and let them know that it is past time to pass the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. While you're at it, you can also let your senators know that it is time to take action on voting rights. Without clear and decisive action to protect the sacred right to vote, all of our priorities hang in the balance, including a strong care economy. Here again, members of the House, y'all, we did our part. We passed not one, not two, but 3 voting rights bills, including the Freedom to Vote Act, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, that's named in honor of my friend, predecessor, and voting rights champion, the late Congressman John Lewis. As a co-chair of the Congressional Voting Rights Caucus, I'm committed to amplifying the voice of the people, breaking down barriers to voting, and safeguarding the integrity of our elections. Everything that we believe in depends on free and fair access to the ballot, no matter your zip code, no matter your bank account. So as we fight for policies to create the economy that she deserves, we can't forget the movement for voting rights. Our vote is our voice. And believe me, y'all, it makes a difference. From pay equity to a care infrastructure and everything in between, your engagement pushes us towards progress. We can get a lot done in Congress, but y'all, we can't do it alone. Keep holding your leaders accountable and speaking up on the issues that you care about out loud and on purpose. That's how we start building an economy that truly works for everyone.
Hello, I'm Layli Mapayan, Executive Director of the Wellesley Centers for Women and Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Welcome to our panel on understanding the role of structural racism in economic inequality. Structural racism refers to the form of racial bias that is baked into society based on the long-term effect of laws, policies, and norms that create advantages for white people and disadvantages for Black and Brown people. Because these laws, policies, and norms operate in the background, often divorced from people's personal feelings about race and racial diversity, they require special attention. One of the most pernicious effects of structural racism is its tendency to exacerbate wealth inequalities between people of different races. We've all seen the data. The average net worth for a white American household is 10 times that of a Black American family. We can't answer the question of how this happened without looking straight into the eye of structural racism. And if we want to change this reality, we have to dismantle structural racism. We also know that we need to look at structural racism intersectionally, meaning that we take race, gender, socioeconomic status, and other variables into consideration simultaneously. One of the earliest findings about the pandemic economy was that people of color, particularly women, were uniquely affected because of their predominance in the service industries: healthcare, childcare, food service, retail and delivery work, utilities, the cleaning and sanitation professions, for example, even agriculture. These were originally the invisible positions: low paid, low status, low flexibility jobs held by Black and brown people, immigrants, and others who were economically marginal. And yet, the pandemic made us realize that along with doctors and nurses, these people were essential workers, people without whom society as we know it can't function. So this finding put us in a conundrum. Here's this group of workers that we must value, and yet we have not valued them. We rely on them, and yet we don't reward them. This is the effect of structural racism on economic inequality in bold relief. The pandemic amplified existing inequalities, and yet it presented us with an opportunity to take more concerted action to eradicate structural racism and its effect on the economic prosperity and security of people of all racial and ethnic groups in the nation. How do we move forward? We have three great panelists today who are prepared to address these themes, particularly as they relate to women. And I'm going to give a quick introduction of each. Their full bios are on the Summit website, and I encourage everyone to take a look. Gloria Perez is president and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, the first statewide women's foundation in the country. The Women's Foundation of Minnesota has distributed more than $31 million through community investments. It conducts ongoing research on the status of women and girls in Minnesota and advocates for public policy that results in greater economic security and safety for women and their families, and invests in organizations and leaders to build the field of service and achieve gender and racial equity. Paulina Lopez Gonzalez is the economist in residence at NDWA Labs, the social innovation partner of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the nation's leading organization working for the power, respect, and dignity of more than 2 million nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers in the United States. Paulina leads NDWA Labs research work to bring more domestic workers into our month-to-month and year-to-year understanding of the economy. Prior to joining NDWA Labs, Paulina served as a Policy and Social Innovations Fellow at NDWA. Before joining the domestic worker movement, she worked as an economist in Mexico's central bank. Rebecca Dixon is Executive Director of the National Employment Law Project, a leading advocacy organization working to build a just and inclusive economy where all workers have expansive rights and thrive in good jobs. Rebecca is a respected national leader in federal workers' rights advocacy and in great demand for her thought leadership at the intersection of labor and racial equality. So now let's begin our conversation. Gloria, Paulina, and Rebecca, thank you for being here. It's a privilege to be sharing the virtual stage with you. And I know this is a topic that we all care about, the relationship between structural racism and economic inequality for women, especially women of color. Not only do we all care about it, but we're all actively working from our respective positions to address these conditions in meaningful and measurable ways. To get our conversation started, I think it would be helpful if our audience could hear you talking about the view from your respective organizations and positions. Let's start with you, Gloria. As president and CEO of the Women's Foundation of Minnesota, you have the enviable position of being able to give out money. That is, to direct funds in ways that solve problems for the women of Minnesota. Tell us about what you're seeing and what the women of Minnesota can help us understand about the plight of women, and in particular women of color, as they navigate both structural racism and economic vulnerability.
Thank you for this question. The Women's Foundation of Minnesota has been partnering with the University of Minnesota to produce a Status of Women and Girls report every 2 years. And we've been doing this in partnership since 2009. And we are looking at the areas of economics, safety, health, and leadership in our research. And what I would say stands out for us right now is that things haven't gotten much better. And in fact, in many regards, women are not faring as well as they were 2 years ago. Obviously, because of the pandemic, I think the uprising for racial justice has certainly been part of that. But in two areas I would point out are that we are centering the finishing line for Latinas, Black, Somali women in Minnesota as our North Star and finish line in the fight for pay equity. That continues to be a big disparity. We heard earlier about, celebrating Equal Pay Day in March. And for Latinas, we're not celebrating Equal Pay Day until December 8th. Because Latinas are making 55 cents on the dollar compared to white men, and it's 61 cents on the dollar for Black women. And so we are centering the people who are most impacted by these inequities in our work. Secondly, I would say that violence and mental health have come out as themes that women are experiencing across the state. And so it's violence in homes, it's bias, it's violence against our Asian Pacific Islanders in Minnesota. And then when we're thinking about the centering of women in families, caring for children and caring for elders, we find that the mental health and fragility of families is at stake. And so I feel like this is not just a Minnesota issue, but something that can resonate nationally.
That makes complete sense. Thank you for sharing that. Paulina, I'd love to turn to you now. As economist in residence at NDWA Labs, your organization has its finger on the pulse of a large constituency of largely women of color in economically precarious positions, namely domestic workers. Yet you live and work in the innovation arm of NDWA. How does being focused on innovation help you see the situation of women of color and economically disadvantaged women generally, and to perhaps see solutions that others don't yet see?
Thank you for that question. At NDWA Labs, we know that there's no single solution to transforming the domestic work industry. As an innovation lab, we build products where they are needed, form partnerships when we can, and work to shift culture where it's creating a barrier. So I'll share a concrete example. Early in the pandemic, at a time when everyone was being cautious against being in touch with people outside their own households, we knew that domestic workers, who by definition work from other people's homes, would face devastating challenges and uncertainties about their work and livelihoods. We needed to know more about the challenges domestic workers were facing in an ever-changing environment. This means we needed more data, and we needed it more frequently, and we needed to know it in real time and at scale. So this is how we decided to explore large-scale surveys as a lever that was not traditionally in our wheelhouse. We rapidly iterated and built upon an automated chatbot we built on Facebook in 2019. So by 2020, NDWA Labs developed our La Alianza News chatbot into a groundbreaking research tool that surveys thousands of Spanish-speaking domestic workers every week, producing first-of-its-kind data for a workforce that is essential but overlooked in mainstream economic analysis. As a part of this ongoing research, we produce regular reports on Spanish-speaking domestic workers' economic situation and working conditions, and we release monthly reports on the economic situation of domestic workers on the same day of the Bureau of Labor Statistics jobs report release, which happens to be today. So we'll have a report coming out later. We aim to fill the existing gap in high quality, frequent data collection and analysis about the domestic work sector. La Alianza workers live in all 50 US states, DC and Puerto Rico. And to our knowledge, it is the largest digital aggregation of Spanish-speaking domestic workers in the country. We have now been surveying domestic workers weekly for more than 2 years. We continue to learn from them every day, and we think we have only scratched the surface. The surveys confirmed at scale what we knew domestic workers were going through: massive job loss, lack of access to government assistance, food insecurity, and housing instability. We hope making visible the state of domestic workers will give us all a fuller understanding of how the most vulnerable among us are doing.
Thank you. These are some brilliant innovations, and I really like how you've leveraged both big data and social media to do this work. Rebecca, your turn now. As executive director of the National Employment Law Project, you have your finger on the pulse of workers' rights, employment equity issues, and of course, the legal frameworks related to all of the above. You've written cogently on things the government can do to strengthen these frameworks because you have an eagle eye for the gaps. What does our audience need to know about what the problem of structural racism feeding economic inequality looks like from your vantage point?
Thank you so much for that question. Opportunity is constrained in this country, and I would go further to say opportunity is segregated in this country. 40% of jobs in our economy pay poverty level wages. And as we've seen on display in this pandemic, the burden of that is uneven, falling most heavily on women and workers of color. In fact, women make up 64% of the 40 lowest paying jobs. Discrimination accounts for 38% of the gender wage gap. For Black women who are at the intersection of their identities, this creates a double bind. The Blacker an occupation is or becomes, the lower the wages. The more female dominated an occupation is, the more undervalued that work is, especially care work. Consequently, Black women's share of the low paid workforce is 5 times their share of the overall workforce. And there's a name for what I'm describing. It's called occupational segregation. Occupational segregation means that persistently, across time, women and people of color have been shunted into low-paying, precarious, and often unsafe work. And occupational segregation's glass and concrete ceilings means that they stay there for decades, sometimes a lifetime. As a country, we've made policy choices that have embedded the structural racism in our laws, policies, and practices. For example, when we passed the New Deal, our foundational labor rights, benefits, protections, things like Social Security, unemployment insurance, the right to organize, we excluded large segments of workers, including an estimated 90% of Black women. That exclusion has meant that race and gender, wealth gaps, and wage gaps have been expanding rather than closing, expanding even as women get more education and training. This means that we need better solutions that center the needs and experiences of women and people of color to ensure that we are purposely including them in our legal and policy remedies that would allow all workers to have expansive rights and thrive in good jobs.
Thank you. That's a very illuminating analysis. So thanks to all of you. My second question gets a little more personal. As a woman of color, there are times when we dig into our cultures, our background, and even at times our own personal journeys to find solutions and think about problems in new ways. Culture in and of itself can be a kind of well of innovation when it comes to social problem solving. What are some perspectives you've drawn and solutions you've created based on your own cultural knowledge of what women of color and their families experience vis-a-vis racism and our economic lives? Rebecca, you've actually spoken openly about growing up in rural Mississippi as the descendant of slaves and sharecroppers and how this has influenced your point of view. So let's start with you.
For me, this has really influenced my perspective on what's needed in the economy and what's possible for women to thrive. So I grew up poor in rural Southwest Mississippi, one of the lushest, greenest places in the summertime. It's also the kind of place that had segregated schools until 1969 and where there were Ku Klux Klan flyers being tacked to our church door in 1989. My grandmother, Allie Mack, and my great-grandmother, Lucille, they were sharecroppers and domestics, and they were 2 of the 90% of Black women who were excluded from the New Deal. And though they worked hard their whole lives, they died with nothing but wisdom and resilience to pass on to me. For me, policy has had real impacts, and those policies have followed for generations. And I understand deeply what is at stake in this work that I do to ensure that race and gender don't determine your fate in the labor market. And I'm still connected to this community where I grew up, so I have a contemporary window into who's being hurt the most by our policy choices. As an attorney, I'm the person who hears from friends, cousins, nieces back home all the time. And often what we're doing is workshopping injustices that have cropped up for them because of occupational segregation. And because occupational segregation is not one-dimensional, it's like a Venn diagram of exploitation and struggle that these women are facing all the time. So for example, my best friend from high school, we've spent time trying to figure out how to appeal an unemployment insurance claim. She's been fired for taking family medical leave. We've had to chase down her employer to get her last paycheck. All of these things are happening all the time for women of color. And we have to look at our solutions. We can't approach them as if Black women's economic security and mobility is all about an individual effort or personal responsibility. We have to actually hold that policy, the way that policy plays in this, and that the federal government has a responsibility to set floors for labor standards and for job quality.
Mm-hmm. It's so important to hear the personal stories behind these kinds of policy changes that we're advocating for. Gloria, you've mentioned that you're originally from San Antonio, Texas, a place that's about 180 degrees from where you are now in Minnesota. So how has your background informed how you see solutions?
Well, indeed, I did go 1,200 miles north to go to college. And part of my decision making and doing that was actually sort of a reckoning with my community about the fact that growing up, education was talked about as a key to economic opportunity. And yet, when I looked at my community, so many of my sisters and cousins and so forth in community were teen moms, and there was, tremendous amount of economic fragility in our community. But my mother was really insistent that I have an opportunity for an education, so I went to a high school that had a pathway into colleges around the country. And that pathway, I would say, planted in me a belief that education for me was possible beyond high school, that I could have a career that was different from so many of the folks in our community. And so I think, number one, that belief gap is something that I have continuously tried to work on. I've been working in 2-generation strategies to end poverty, working with women who have a belief now, but at the same time need to be reminded on a continuous basis that the work that the goals that they're working for are achievable. Secondly, I would say that growing up, it was very family oriented. We were not individualistic. We were communistic. And in that sense, leaving so that I could focus on my own education and surround myself in a more stable environment, if you will, was a difficult decision to make. And I think one that now young Latinas are maybe not willing to make, and they shouldn't be penalized for that. I think that we need to think about our systems being more holistic and taking into consideration the fact that women of color live in communities, and as was just expressed, we are constantly helping each other troubleshoot the systemic challenges that we all face. And so that's been an important thing for me. And then lastly, I would say to introduce early on to young women of color career options that have high paying opportunities and growth and leadership opportunities is really so important. So having role models is critical.
Thank you. Those points really highlight the importance of having multiple pathways to success and digging into culture for, what those roadmaps actually look like. So Paulina, your personal journey has origins in Mexico. How does this background shape an international perspective on solutions to structural racism and economic inequality?
So I would say one thing that growing up in Mexico and later moving to the US has made clear is that domestic workers face very similar challenges worldwide. There's low pay, lack of benefits, rampant abuse, and the systemic oppression they face, while it's contextually different, also comes from racist and sexist structures. So in my work at NDWA Labs, I frequently communicate with Spanish-speaking domestic workers, many of whom immigrated to the US from my own home country. And many of them were domestic workers before as well. They come to the US and face additional barriers as immigrants and non-native English speakers. One way this manifested during the pandemic, for example, was in the lack of government assistance and relief for most of these workers. So we need to address structural racism and inequality within individual countries, but we also need to look at the global systems of oppression that replicate these dynamics at a larger scale.
Thank you. We've heard a lot of things lately about the post-pandemic future of work. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this concept for women of color, whether women of color at the margins economically or women of color who are more economically secure but may still face other hardships. What issues have you heard women of color talking about with regard to the future of work? I know, for example, in my own case, I've heard people talking about overwork and burnout, but I've also heard women of color talking about how remote work reduces their exposure to office microaggressions and other forms of racism in the workplace. Of course, not all women of color have the freedom to work remotely, so this in and of itself is an issue. But what kinds of things are you hearing? I think, Rebecca, let's begin with you.
Earlier in the pandemic, I was hearing about folks working at schools and being uncomfortable going back into the classroom and feeling really like they had their back against the wall because they needed their job. I've also heard about the challenges with childcare and the way that the pandemic really messed up the system of childcare that wasn't really great to begin with. And so even when it is affordable, it's sometimes not available, or it's closing with some frequency because of exposure to COVID. So just really struggling with childcare and trying to balance that. And then also the fact that a lot of the jobs that they're in don't have paid time off, and just really being terrified that they're going to lose their job because they have to stay home with a sick child or stay home with a quarantine child. So just really trying to juggle all of that, and trying to juggle all of that in addition to sort of already being stretched super thin.
Yeah, I appreciate that point, especially because we know that many women are also, struggling as single parents, and childcare is that much more essential when you're a single parent as well. So, I appreciate you elevating that issue. Gloria, what kinds of things have you been hearing about the future of work from your constituencies?
Well, what I've been hearing and reading is flexibility continues to be critically important. And like you say, that is not a privilege that many low wage workers have. And so thinking about that, I think will be really important. And being able to bring your full self and be respected in the workplace. And I think part of that respect includes having the employers understand that we live in community and have multiple pressures, whether it's with young children or older adults that we are caring for. And so just being able to bring that reality into the workplace and still be respected for the expertise that women have and bring to the work is really important.
Thank you. Paulina, what about you? What are you observing?
Well, I would resonate a lot with what's been already mentioned, childcare, and I would also add family care, caring for elderly adults with disabilities or illnesses, and this is a universal issue. I will say as well that the future of work conversation is often fairly limited to white-collar jobs in offices, largely captivated with the tech industry. But the pandemic really showed the division of how we think about work. There was this conversation on one hand, focus on what will we do if we can't go to the office, how will workers cope at home with children, with their school needs. Meanwhile, there was a whole other workforce, which we also called essential workers, who can't work from home. And there was a focus of a separate conversation due to the conditions that came to light, and low wages, risk of getting sick, and all of these other factors that we know. We actually often refer to domestic workers as the original gig workers because they have long known the precariousness of low wages, job insecurity, few to no benefits, wage theft, uncertainty about scheduling, and other conditions that workers in many more industries are facing today. So I think we should build a new system where living wages are guaranteed and benefits are available to all people instead of to particular types of jobs. When we address the root causes of inequality and not only the symptoms, then we can not only lift up workers in the margins, but we will lift everyone up.
I couldn't agree more. And another issue that I would just throw into the mix is the issue of having family-friendly work schedules. I think this sort of tacks onto what you were saying, Gloria, about flexibility, and being able to predict your schedule, get your kids to school on time without having to, cancel out on a shift and so on. Those kinds of things. It's time to make a human-centric work culture for essential workers. It really is. All right, so we're sort of sliding into our last bit of time. And so I want to end on a very practical question. And that question is really aimed at the policymakers in our audience. Based on your areas of work, each of you is in a position to make policy suggestions that could advance equity and well-being for women of color and their families. And of course, we know that this is not a zero-sum game, because bettering the policy climate for women of color will also lift other boats and ultimately make life better for everybody. So candidly, what is your policy wish list? I hope that our policymakers are getting out their notepads. Maybe if you could each give like 3 of your top policies on your policy wish list. Paulina, I'd love to start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll mention 2 key things on my list.
Okay.
One is that we need a National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights to extend basic rights and protections to domestic workers. This has been mentioned before, but when most of the country's workplace laws were being designed, domestic workers were specifically excluded because of racism and sexism. This is part of the exclusions that Rebecca was talking about earlier. So we need to right these historic wrongs by making care jobs good jobs. That's why the National Domestic Workers Alliance is working to win the National Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, which was introduced last summer to establish rights for millions of home care workers, nannies, and house cleaners in the US. 10 states and 2 major cities have already passed Domestic Workers Bill of Rights or protections due to the relentless leadership of domestic worker organizing, and yet the federal recognition and comprehensive protection for this workforce is long overdue. The second piece on my list, which is also related, is that we need to invest in care infrastructure. Care jobs are the jobs that power the rest of our economy. We need a care infrastructure just like the basic infrastructure we have around roads, bridges, and broadband, but we need one that is focused on families, consumers, and workers. President Joe Biden set a precedent with his proposal to commit billions of dollars to care work, setting a strong message that care work is essential. So these investments in home and community-based services will create millions of new care jobs and allow working families to access affordable care services for their loved ones.
It's a great wish list. Rebecca, what's your wish list?
I will also stick to 2. The first one, pass a higher federal minimum wage and abolish the sub-minimum tipped wage for youth workers, restaurant workers, and workers with disabilities. A majority of Black workers live in the South, so Black women, this is the only way they're going to get a raise in the South is if the federal minimum wage is raised, because a lot of those states don't have a state minimum wage. And then the second thing I would say is we saw how crucial and critical unemployment insurance benefits were in this pandemic. And we know that single moms and single parents tend to lose their jobs more frequently and have longer times out of the workforce trying to find a new job. So it's crucial to fix this program for good. During the pandemic, Congress went in and added $600 a week and added whole categories of workers, so like low-wage workers, independent contractors, and they added additional weeks of benefits. But then by Labor Day, that had expired for everyone. And in many states, there are huge gaps in this program. And so I would encourage policymakers on a state level and also on the federal level to fix this program for good and to provide the critical standards around access and of course around adequacy, benefit adequacy.
Those suggestions would go a long way. Gloria, what's your policy wish list?
Well, I love what has been said already. I would say in Minnesota, we're working on paid family medical leave, and the ability to have that at a federal level would certainly be very beneficial. In addition to what's been said, I would say that the child tax credit has been incredibly beneficial, and we've been able to see, like just through July to December, that 33% of families were lifted out of poverty. And so that's a great example of just the impact that $500 a month more can make for a low-income family. But I'll end with that livable wage for all is really important.
Thank you. That's great. And again, I couldn't agree more. Now, I did leave a little bit of time for audience questions, and only one question has come in so far. And I'd like to ask each of you to give a brief answer to this question. This questioner would like to know how you've been effective at influencing policy with your work. I know that each of your organizations talks to policymakers, so if you could just give one nugget about your method and success there, that would be great. Paulina, let's start with you.
Thank you. This is a great question. I have the honor of working in a social movement, so we have a lot of different levers. As I mentioned before, I sit within the innovation arm of the domestic worker movement, but there's also a very effective and amazing field team. There's organizing happening that powers everything that we do. There's a policy team that also advocates for and works on all these policies that I was mentioning that are also part of my wish list. So I think it's a really effective way to just mix different methods and tactics to all look at the same North Star. And I feel very lucky to be a part of that.
Great, thank you. Gloria, what methods have you found to be effective in your work?
Well, we always lead with research and data, and listening to community is one of the elements of that. And so to have a broad coalition that we are working with has been really important, as well as centering the voices and lived experience of people across the community. And so when you hear a woman's experience, it really sheds light that legislators often don't get to hear.
Thank you. Rebecca, you get the last word.
So I will circle back to unemployment insurance. So NELP has been working on unemployment insurance as an expert and leader for decades. So on the federal level, and also providing a lot of support to state groups that work on unemployment insurance in their states. And we were instrumental to winning these expansions for unemployment insurance in this pandemic. A total of almost $700 billion extra dollars going into families' pockets at this crucial, critical time when the economy was shut down. So I think that the long expertise, the working at it has definitely meant that we've become more effective over time and been able to seek remedies that are actually much more targeted at women and workers of color.
Well, thank you. This has been a great conversation, but we're at time. So I want to take this opportunity to thank each one of you again, not just for your remarks today, but for the important work you're doing to dismantle racism and increase the prosperity of women of color and their families, and indeed people across the board. And I know our audience also thanks you. So with great appreciation, thank you.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here today with Jennifer Klein. Jennifer Klein is one of the United States' foremost experts in gender equality and many of the most critical issues American women face today in the workplace and at home. She's currently the director of the White House Gender Policy Council, the first ever independent office focused on gender equity and equality within the executive branch, which President Biden established as one of his first acts in office. For more than 25 years, Jen, and I am going to call her Jen because we're old friends, Jen has devoted herself to furthering gender equality in both the public and private sectors. That work has included serving as the Chief Strategy and Policy Officer at Time's Up, as co-chair of the Women and Families Policy Committee during the Biden-Harris campaign, as senior advisor on women's issues during Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign, and as a senior advisor in the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues, which is where I first met Jen. So Jen, I want to begin by just thanking you for your ongoing leadership on issues related to gender equality and equity. And I'm so pleased to be with you here to discuss the work of the Council, the importance of gender-based policymaking, and to hear your views on the steps we need to take short-term and long-term to achieve gender equality and equity for women. So just to start, in an interview from about a year ago, when President Biden established the Gender Policy Council, you said, and I quote, "This is not just a council. It's a plan to take a government-wide approach to gender equity and equality." You're now a year or so in. How's that approach working, and where are you focused?
Thanks, Paula. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me today. As you said, we've known each other a long time, and I know we will get into the conversation a little bit later. But as I was thinking about today, I was thinking about how I literally sought you out when you were at a previous job at Harvard, because you were one of the few people who at that point was really focused on gender and racial disparities in healthcare. And when we wanted to educate ourselves about how to approach those issues, I honestly don't remember how I found you, but I knew you were the person to go to. So you also have been working on that and other gender equity issues for a very long time. So thank you. So your question, as you said, early in the administration, the president launched the Gender Policy Council by executive order. It was last year on International Women's Day, March 8th. And what he did and what he felt strongly about, and why I was excited about taking this job, was that this was similar to other offices that had existed in previous administrations, but with several differences. And the differences are really important. The first is we're a policy council. So all of our work is geared toward what the appropriate federal policy should be to advance gender equity and equality. And the second part is that it's both global and domestic. So again, you know, as you know, as most people I'm sure who are tuning in know, these are issues that don't stop at borders, they cross borders. So, you know, over the course of the last year, the first thing we did was we launched a government-wide strategy, and really taking advantage of our relationships and our work across every policy council here at the White House. So the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, and the Domestic Policy Council, as well as the other new policy council, which is the National Climate Council, but also, and really importantly, the work all across the federal government. So as part of this council, every cabinet secretary and agency head is formally a member. And each of them appointed a senior designee who we work with regularly to ensure that the strategy is implemented across the entire government, and that they are identifying their priorities to advance gender equity and gender equality really as part of this whole of government effort. And then I would say, you know, the only other thing I'd add about our work in particular, because as you can see, our special sauce is that we are working really across the government. You know, one maybe known, maybe little known secret is that this council is actually quite small. We're a startup, so we have a small staff, and the way that we have been able to do our work is, as I said, by engaging people really across the federal government. But if I had to choose, which is hard to do, sort of three major issues that we are focused on here at the council, it's economic security for women, it's gender-based violence wherever it occurs, and the last I would say is women's health, and that includes reproductive health, but beyond reproductive health.
No, that is really, first of all, I want to say small, but small and mighty.
That's what we call it.
That's right, is your group. And those are such critical areas to work on as we think about these issues. And, you know, with that being said, you know, last October, you helped launch, the council launched the White House's first ever national strategy on gender equity and equality. And it was really a 42-page strategy that touches on policies that are pretty wide ranging in many of the areas that you discussed. And it really, one of the things that the strategy states is that that achieving gender equity in the economy really requires not just policy reform, but a shift in the social and cultural norms that undermine gender equity and equality, undervalue work traditionally and disproportionately carried by women, and prevent rights on paper from being fully implemented in practice. So that's a pretty big shift. What do you think needs to happen in order for that type of shift that you described to take place? Who needs to be kind of thinking about it in the lead?
I think it's really, you know, that old adage or whatever it is, the saying about the three-legged stool. I really think it is a three-legged stool here. I think there is obviously an extremely important role for the federal government, for the government, federal, state, local, tribal. And that's why we felt very strongly about having a strategy on paper and then moving quickly from having a strategy on paper, quite frankly, to implementing that strategy, which is, part 3 of the strategy is how are we rolling up our sleeves, as I said before, across the government to actually implement the strategy, and what principles underlie it. So there's obviously a huge role for government here. We can talk more about this, but I think there's a connection between policy making and norm change, and it's sort of hopefully a virtuous cycle that if you change policies, it affects norms and people's behavior, but also you need norms to change and people's behavior to change in order to drive policy making. So that's sort of the government role, which, as I said, to me is quite significant. But we can't do this work without the private sector. And as we see, during COVID and the racial reckoning that we have had in this country over the last couple of years, private companies are stepping up to change their policies, their practices, which has real impact on their employees and also on the economy more generally. And then, of course, the role of civil society. So the importance of engaging and supporting the leadership of women and girls and their full participation. Helping women and girls step up to run for office or serve in nonprofit jobs and roles, to defend civil and human rights. All of these things are instrumental, and again, can't be done with that, that civil society contribution as well.
Yep. So it's really both a top-down, but also a bottom-up approach that you really are kind of really looking to enhance moving forward. Exactly. And as I think about your blueprint, in thinking about the whole government approach, which is pretty powerful, and in a way is intersectional, right? Making sure that these issues are in every corner, and you also focus on an intersectional approach as we think about women writ large. And can you just talk a little bit about that and why that's so important?
Yeah, as I said, or maybe I didn't say it specifically, the first part of the strategy, before we get to those 10 intersecting policy areas that you mentioned, and that third part, which I talked about, which is the implementation of the strategy, we thought long and hard about the principles that underlay this entire strategy. And I would say, number one is that the work has to be intersectional. And that's for the obvious reason that humans are full people, and they experience overlapping forms of discrimination. And we need to be mindful of that and very specific and intentional about addressing that. So in addition to thinking about the intersection between gender and race, we're thinking about a range of other factors, whether that's religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, age, or socioeconomic status. All of those factors need to be taken into account when you're thinking about policy solutions.
Yeah. And I guess, Jen, that would then take me into another area, because in order to take that approach, gender-based analysis in those dimensions is really important. That is where I spent so much, as you mentioned earlier, of my life, and in ensuring that we thought about those intersecting identities around data where they had not necessarily been looked at. So in what ways does a gender-based analysis approach, lead to really informed policy making? And how do we think about instituting and making sure that that approach is undertaken? Because I don't think we can take it for granted necessarily.
Yeah, it could not agree more. I think there's a couple of things to point to. The first is that, again, as part of the president's commitment really early on, he asked for a focus on equity really across both data and policy. And there is, a cohort of people here at the Office of Management and the Budget at the Domestic Policy Council, and that is what they're thinking about. And literally, there is an equitable data working group. So, just to move to the very specific nitty-gritty of how this gets implemented, we are looking across government at the data we collect, and as you know, the data we don't collect, to ensure that we are thinking about equity in all of that. And as you know, one of the things that I worked on in the past was gender data, because, as to quote my former boss and mentor Hillary Clinton, another Wellesley grad, if we don't measure it, we don't do it. So that is why I personally take really seriously, but really across this administration, we are taking seriously, looking deeply at the data, making sure that we are both collecting disaggregated data, but also thinking about how all of these data pieces fit together. So that's just sort of generally how we approach the work. And I would say really, as I said, not just the Gender Policy Council, but really across this federal government. And I'll give you just one example. The president launched in health, the president launched the Cancer Cabinet and a Cancer Moonshot. And one of the things that is really important to me about that is that, first of all, the Gender Policy Council is part of the Cancer Cabinet. And we're looking at cancer, not just women's cancers and not just the data that is collected on women's cancers, but how you are paying attention to gender equity really across all of the work on cancer. So whether that's research, whether that's prevention, whether that's treatment, there is a focus on looking at the data and, again, figuring out where we don't have the data and how we can fill those data gaps, and then how that data informs policymaking.
Yeah. Jen, that is it's really so wonderful to hear. And, I'm thinking about what you're doing. And, an administration is only but so many years. This is the 4-8. And so the changes you're making are really so critical because they will be long lasting. If we can change the infrastructure on how we are thinking about these issues, it lives long beyond any single administration, which is just phenomenal.
That is the idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I just want to turn for a moment to some of the work still going on regarding the support for childcare, paid leave, universal pre-K. These are particularly the childcare and paid leave. They've always been important, but I think the pandemic just heightened the focus on them. Where are those efforts now? And are they a part of the Build a Better America bill? Or are you thinking about addressing some of these pieces separately?
Well, it's a great day to ask that question. Today, the president announced his fiscal year 23 budget, and all of those pieces remain in his budget. So we are absolutely continuing to work on them, for all the reasons that you said and more. So, just to take, childcare or prescription drugs or other healthcare costs or pre-K. The budget reflects your values, and this administration's values is to continue to invest in those things, to help families lower their costs, and also be able to raise their kids in a way that ends up with kids who are well prepared, well educated. So just to take childcare as an example, we know that families in this country are paying way too much for childcare if they can find it, right? So there's an accessibility question, and then there's an affordability question. And so what we've been working on is really trying to figure out how to, first of all, lower families' costs for childcare. And that enables people who want to work, parents who want to work, to be able to get to work. And that actually helps them support their families, and that actually helps their kids. And also, to ensure that care, whether it's childcare or preschool, is high quality, because as I said, obviously over time that also pays dividends for kids themselves and also for the economy as a whole. There's strong data over many years about the importance of ensuring that childcare and pre-K are of high quality. So that's what we're continuing to do. continuing to support all of the policies that you mentioned, childcare, paid leave, elder care. One of the things that we have watched, as you just referenced in this pandemic, is that, I walked around saying, we had a health crisis, and then we had an economic crisis, and then on top of that, we had a child care crisis. And that a care crisis, not just a child care crisis. And that care crisis continues. And, by the way, it existed before the pandemic. Maybe it got worse, exacerbated, but it was there before. And the only silver lining here that I can find is that we now see it. And I don't really think that we as a country can look away. So I feel still confident that we are going to pass care policies, as I said, whether that's child care or elder care or paid leave, because people see not only that it's important to an individual and that it's an individual's responsibility to provide care for their family, but that there's a benefit to everybody for there to be a care infrastructure in place so that people can work, so that they can support their families, which has benefits for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and really for the entire economy.
No, it supports, it's good for everybody. And I would imagine that these are exactly the arguments and the data that you're using as you are really looking to build support, across the aisle, both within the party and also with the Republican side of the party, of our government.
Yeah, and I'll just mention one other thing, which is that, we're mostly talking about here in the US, but another thing that hasn't yet been announced, but that we are working on is a global project, which is called Build Back Better World, where the G7 initially came together to focus on infrastructure around the world, and that includes things like digital and health infrastructure. It also includes gender equality. One of the 4 pillars of this initiative is gender equality, and one of the things that we're working on within that pillar, as I said, yet to be announced, so stay tuned for the details, is specifically on the care infrastructure, because this is not just a US problem. This is a problem that really exists around the world, and there are many lower and middle income countries that, again, have realized before, but are now investing in that care infrastructure.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful to hear that, again, both the domestic but also the global perspective. And what the pandemic has shown anything, it is that the global perspective is so absolutely critical on pretty much every issue. And I would say on this one, Jen, there is a lot for us. First of all, it's a priority around the world, but there's a lot for us to learn as well from other countries, right? That we can import here to the United States, both not only around the policy, but what the impact of those policies have been, and clearly positive impact on economies. So great. I'm just so pleased to hear it. Can we just turn to gender-based violence for a few minutes? We know that this is, as you mentioned earlier, a priority, and we've only seen gender-based violence increased during the pandemic. What do you see as the connections between this increase and economic security challenges that we're facing? And then just, turn to what you think might be some of the measures we need to take to confront this issue.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right to point out, and not everybody sees the connection between gender-based violence and economic security, but it is. I mean, it's often the thing that prevents somebody from leaving an abuser. It also prevents them sometimes from working, so that, it has long-term impacts, or being able to find housing has long-term economic impacts beyond the obvious, physical and mental health aspects of gender-based violence. And, again, this is an issue that the president has long worked on and championed. Just last week, he signed the reauthorization and strengthening of the Violence Against Women Act, which I always say it takes about 4 minutes into being with this man before he will tell you that he was the initial author of the first Violence Against Women Act in the early 90s, and it has been reauthorized and strengthened several times since then, but it hadn't been since 2013. So this was a big, literally a year-long process to get bipartisan support, which there were 11 Republican and 11 Democratic co-sponsors for the reauthorization, and it just passed as part of the omnibus last week, and the president was able to sign it. But it makes that connection very clearly. So for example, in the previous reauthorization, it significantly expanded housing protections so that people could be able to afford housing if they were leaving an abusive situation. But that's just, one example among many. Another example besides the Violence Against Women Act is a couple of weeks ago, I think it was March 3rd, the president signed the Ending Forced Arbitration Act for Sexual Harassment and Sexual Assault, which is, again, another great example of the connection between economic issues, because what does that do? It says that people who experience sexual assault or sexual harassment in the workplace are not forced to arbitrate. They can decide to use arbitration as a means of resolving a dispute, but they're also not precluded from going to court to have their case heard in the judicial system. And so again, we have all seen and experienced over the last number of years the impact that sexual harassment has, driving people out of the workforce, preventing them from moving up. Again, it's bad in and of itself, obviously, to state the obvious, to be sexually harassed at work, but it also, there is a huge economic piece of this, which often gets overlooked.
Yeah. Well, that is, first of all, those are such major accomplishments. And we thank you for all the work that you're doing, the leadership of the president in really making these issues a priority. And Jen, all I can say is I could probably spend several hours talking with you, but this is such critically important work. We are so glad that you are leading this with this administration. I urge the audience to really take a look at the report, National Strategy on Gender Equity and Equality, and we'll look forward to the work ahead. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your work and for letting me speak with you today.